Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight for our second meeting. I would like to call this meeting to order. Would you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. My name is Richard Gaines, and I'm a member of the St. Louis Public Schools Special Administrative Board and the chair of the Special Committee on Governance reviewing the district's governance options. I would also like to recognize, I don't know if Rick is here yet or not, Rick Sullivan, who is a member of this body, the SAB, and Dawnetta Clinkscale, who is a member of the Special Administrative Board. In addition, Dr. Kelvin Adams. Dr. Adams, are you in the auditorium? If you are back in the back, who is the Superintendent of Schools of St. Louis Public Schools. Now, there are or may be members of the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Would those members please either stand or raise your hand? And any elected officials in the audience, would you please stand and identify yourself by simply stating your name? Any back in the back? Is there anyone that did not get recognized or did not stand? Thank you for being here tonight. Before we begin tonight, I want to mention that we do have free child care services available during our meeting. If you want to take advantage of this service, please go to our registration table and you will be directed to the child care room. Also, before we begin, we want to address Senate Bill 781. It changes the Special Administrative Board, it charges rather, the Special Administrative Board with the task, excuse me, with the task of reviewing the exploration of alternative forms of governance for the St. Louis School District. We realize this is one of the last major responsibilities we must accomplish before we complete our service to the children and families of this city. John Dalton, St. Louis Public Schools General Counsel, is going to provide further legal context to better frame our discussion this evening. John?
As Mr. Gaines said, my name is John Dalton. I'm a partner with the law firm Armstrong Teasdale. I have the privilege of serving as counsel to the St. Louis Public Schools and particularly to this Special Administrative Board, to this Special Committee on Governance. I've been asked to just comment and put some context to Senate Bill 781 and what is going on and what's been charged to this committee and how it intends to proceed and why. As most people know, Senate Bill 781 was enacted in 1998 by the Missouri General Assembly, and it was a landmark piece of legislation. It was heavily negotiated among all stakeholders, and it did two major things. Number one, it facilitated the settlement of decades of desegregation litigation. And number two, it set up a specific system of governance in the event the St. Louis Public Schools lost accreditation. With respect to that second element, it's important to remember that the Missouri General Assembly created the Special Administrative Board. And the Missouri General Assembly conferred upon that body certain authorities and certain responsibilities. The SAB can do nothing more and nothing less than what Senate Bill 781 says it can do. For purposes of this special committee's work, it is important to note two things. Number one, the SAB stays in existence until the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education says so. They are not holding on to power. The SAB is just trying to complete the assignment that it was given. Number two, the SAB is duty-bound. It is obligated to explore alternative forms of governance for the district. That's what the law says. What the law does not say is how the SAB should discharge its duties and make those recommendations. Obviously, the path that the Special Administrative Board has chosen is to create a special committee, which it is authorized under law to do, and to populate that committee with individuals possessing diverse skill sets, experiences, and perspectives. Moreover, this committee has reached out to noted experts and the community at large for advice in making its report. Then, with the benefit of the committee's report, the SAB will be better equipped to fulfill its obligation under Missouri law. Happy to answer any questions, Mr. Gaines.
Any questions in reference to our charge? Thank you, Mr. Dalton. With that in mind, we have taken great care to form a diverse special committee with representation from key stakeholder groups across our community. The primary purpose of these meetings is to inform the special committee as fully as possible on three possible models of school board governance: elected, appointed, and hybrid models. Armed with this information, the committee is charged with making a recommendation to the SAB for the most appropriate model for St. Louis Public Schools moving forward. After tonight's meeting on appointed board governance, we will hold one more meeting next Monday, November 13th. We plan to meet at Northwest High School to hear about hybrid board governance from Michael Casserly of the Council of Great City Schools. All of our meetings will begin promptly at 6:30 p.m. and will be broadcast live on the district's Facebook page. The format for each meeting will be as follows: a 30 to 35-minute presentation by the guest speaker, followed by questions from the special committee. Each committee member may ask up to 2 questions. Following that, we will take any and all questions and comments from the public. Those who wish to speak must sign in at the registration table, and we will call speakers in the order in which they signed in. Public comments will be limited to 3 minutes, and we have a timer up front that you can see and we can see. This time allowance will be strictly adhered to for the benefit of allowing everyone who wants to comment an opportunity to speak. Please know that this meeting will continue until all people who want to speak publicly have spoken. Again, if you wish to speak publicly and you have not done so already, please sign up at the registration table. We will call your name in the order in which you sign in. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Ms. Rebecca Addison. If she is here tonight, Ms. Addison was the last person to sign up to speak on Monday night at Vashon. Excuse me, she was inadvertently overlooked at the end of the meeting. If Ms. Addison is here tonight, she will be permitted to speak first when we get to the public comment section. If you do not wish to make a comment publicly, there are other ways to give your feedback. You can speak directly to a court reporter in the next room, complete the blue comment form you received when you signed in, and drop it in a comment box at the comment area on your way out. Type your comments on one of our iPads at the comment area, or call our hotline at 314-345-5755 and leave a voicemail message. Again, that number is 314-345-5755. Lastly, if you want to tweet, we have a hashtag. It is hashtag SLPS governance. That's hashtag SLPS governance. Based on feedback from our last meeting, I also want to clarify that all comments, including those made on the Facebook live broadcast, will be included in the final report, which will also be posted on the district website at www.slps.org/governance in early January. After we have held all 3 public meetings focusing on the different types of governance models, we will then administer an online survey. This survey will go live on November 14th and close at midnight on November 28th. It will allow everyone, students, parents, educators, and interested community members to give their preference on what form of governance they think the district should have going forward. The results of this survey will also be part of the final report. One more housekeeping matter. There have been questions about the $80,000 investment that has been made in this process. We're doing all of this because we have an opportunity to do this process the right way, as it will have a long-term impact on our children. The investment is paying for our community engagement and meeting consultants who are responsible for meeting facilitation, the online survey, and data analysis and report generation, legal services, radio, print, and social media advertising, audio-visual services, court report services, deaf interpreters, childcare, meeting refreshments, and printed materials. Finally, none of us serving on this committee are getting paid. We are all volunteers who care and are committed to our children. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to take a minute to introduce our volunteer special committee. They are Ms. Addie Bond, a parent of 3 elementary children in one of our district neighborhood schools; Ms. Charlie Cooksey, representing the St. Louis Elected School Board; Mr. Ray Cummings, representing the Teachers Union, AFT Local 420; Ms. Stephanie Hudson, an attorney and professor of law at St. Louis University and Lindenwood University; Pastor Mike Jones, senior pastor of Friendly Temple Baptist Church; Mr. Rich McClure, who is absent this evening due to another appointment; and Mr. Dave Meredith, who as well is not here, being that he is in California at the graduation of one of his children who is graduating from boot camp, if you will. Mr. Adolphus Pruitt, Executive Director of the St. Louis Chapter of the NAACP, and our newest member, Mr. Kalen Holloway, a teacher from our host school this evening, Central Visual and Performing Arts High School. Mr. Holloway replaces Rolanda Gladden, who stepped down following the previous meeting. Thank you all for accepting this role without hesitation. Your work has the potential to impact generations of St. Louisans. And now I would like to introduce our speaker on the topic of appointed board governance. I would also like to point out that all of the speakers' full information, as well as detailed information about this process, is all available online at www.slps.org/governance. With that said, with us tonight we have Dr. Kenneth Wong. Professor Wong is the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Professor of Education Policy and directs the Urban Education Policy Program at Brown University. Professor Wong is also Professor of Public Policy and Urban Studies at Brown University. Professor Wong has conducted extensive research in education policy, urban school governance, innovation, and accountability. He is the author of several books and over 100 articles, and his research has received support from the National Science Foundation, the Institute for Education Sciences, the U.S. Department of Education, and several foundations. Professor Wong has engaged in numerous projects that use research to improve policy and practice in urban districts. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenneth Wong.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gaines, and Mr. Gaines and members of the special committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share with you some of my research on urban school governance. And I also want to applaud the fact that this is a cross-sectional stakeholding participation committee with parents, elected school board members, SAB members, as well as teachers, and NAACP, as well as other important community sectors. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you with regard to my own research. And I also I'm very heartened by the fact that there are so many of you who show up at 6:30 tonight participating in this public forum. And we do need a whole village to support public education. And we should all care about the future of our children. And that's the future of the city. And so I'm very heartened by the fact that all of you are here tonight and setting aside some of your other activities and spending the time and the attention with us today. So I'm a researcher, and so what I'm going to share with you is, in a way, it is an easier job on my part because you are all the experts who know firsthand what's going on in St. Louis public schools. And I'm an outsider, I'm a researcher. I'm here today to bring to you a perspective outside of the city. And maybe some of the ideas are relevant, maybe some of them are helpful in terms of your thinking about the next step and the next phase of school governance reform. And maybe some of them are totally irrelevant. And so I leave it up to you to make those decisions and assess the relevance of the evidence, the relevance of the argument, and the broader implications, as well as the fact that you are actually in the middle of this in a very fast pace, and that there is a timetable, and you are benefiting from a lot of experts, as well as the committee's perspective. So I would encourage you to take the totality of all the evidence in front of you, and I'm going to share with you what I've been doing in terms of my own research. And today I'm going to share with you one area of my own work, and that is to really understand the design and the implementation, as well as the effects of appointed boards in urban school districts. At some other time, I'd be happy to talk about some other works that I've been doing. I also study decentralization and urban school leadership and so on. But they are all kind of interrelated. But most important of all today, I think we are going to talk about the very, very important kind of system-wide conditions. I always look at urban school governance as a very important component in understanding and pushing our urban schools to do an even better job. And why is that? Because I think school governance can enable what's going on in the classroom, and I'll go through those kind of thinking with you in just a few minutes. The enabling conditions are the one that we are trying to leverage. And sometimes we are less successful doing that, and sometimes we're more successful. And I'm going to share with you some of my findings on those considerations. So again, I just want to underscore that I'm going to bring to you all the research that I've done on the appointed boards, both the pluses and the limitations, as well as what some of the key lessons that I feel that may be helpful in your conversation, in your deliberation, in terms of the next phase of school governance here in the district. So urban school systems have certain unique challenges across the country. So first of all, the concentration of children. 45% of our children are attending the largest 400 urban school districts. And the scale and the concentration of children is what we need to think about. Now imagine that across the country we have 16,000 school districts, and 400 of them enroll 45% of our school children. So urban education must be a top priority from my perspective. That is, in order to really move our public education system forward, we really need to improve all our largest public school districts. And the challenge, of course, is that we have a high concentration of high-need students, not only in terms of racial, ethnic, linguistic immigration status, and so on, but also in terms of income and in terms of mental health and traumas. And so I think we really need to think about strategies from a governance perspective. How can the governing system work for those children who are in need in our urban schools? So that's the first challenge that I see in a lot of urban districts across the country. The second one is the fragmentation within the system. We all know too well about what we call bureaucracy, right? So there are silos within the bureaucracy, there are divisions, they don't talk to one another. But from a governance perspective, we also have fragmentation of power and resources and commitment. So oftentimes when we have a school board, for example, who are elected by their own constituencies, their primary responsibilities often would be focusing on their constituencies who elect them. And so when we have to deal with systemic issues for the district as a whole, then we'll have to think about ways to break down some of these boundaries of fragmentation. And also, in a typical local school board election across the country, we usually see a pretty low turnout. So, for example, in New York City, for a number of years, they will talk about 4% turnout rate for the eligible voters who come out to vote for elected school board members. So across the country, we do need to think about that challenge in urban district. And finally, the challenge is the commitment on the part of parents and the diverse community. And I have studied a lot in terms of the outmigration of parents across all racial, ethnic, and income lines. So Chicago, for example, there has been a ongoing outmigration of African-American middle-class parents, and there has been an outmigration of Latino parents as well. And so in a lot of communities, we do need to think about why are these parents moving out of the district to look for schooling opportunities just down the street, across to the other side of the district. So urban school leaders need to think about some of these challenges. So why do we want to focus on school governance? I studied school governance. That's why I want everybody to pay attention. Obviously, I'm biased, right, in that regard. But at the same time, I do feel that there's a tremendous opportunities for us to really think about the aims. What is the purpose of school governance? And I identify here 5 potential aims for us to think about. So regardless of whether St. Louis is going to move forward with a elected school board or appointed board or a hybrid or some other forms, we do need to think about the purpose of governance. And what are some of these purposes that might serve the larger societal needs? And number one is representation. We do want to have a school governance system that is representative of the social demographic characteristics of the community. But in addition to that, we also need to think about a collective vision. This is not enough for us to have descriptive representation from different neighborhoods and income class and racial, ethnic, linguistic, sexual orientation representation. But more than that, I think we need to think about the conditions of governance that would encourage, motivate all the key participants to work with one another to create a collective vision for the urban district. Number 2 is accountability. I think school governance as a guiding principle ought to think about how do we hold the leaders accountable? Do we have transparency? And for example, Mr. Gaines just mentioned how that $80,000 is being used. That's transparency. That's an example of transparency. So I think it's important for school governance to establish procedure and processes and make sure that the parents and the public are fully engaged and be able to have access to timely information so that they will be a part of this contributing to the conversation. Number 3 is capacity to act. We have to think about the school board as a as a structure. Whether that structure is going to be passive or active is up to all of us to think about. So we want to turn the school governance into an active contributor to the public education improvement process. So we need to think about how governance can enable school and teachers to do their job in the school and the classroom level. And number 4 is leverage partnership. And we know that schooling challenges is not isolated from social environment, right? We know what kind of neighborhoods that we have to deal with. There's gun violence, there's trauma, there are all kinds of mental health issues. And so schools cannot be insulated from some of these other domains. So we need to work with one another. We need to work with university, for example, to improve their teacher training program. We need to work with a mental health agency. We need to work with social Department of Justice to track, the in and out school dropout problem and so on. So I think it's important to think about school governance as an opportunity to leverage broader community partnership. And finally, can school governance create some incentives to continue to challenge the system so that we can continue to innovate? And we should not be complacent with what we have accomplished. For example, I note that St. Louis graduation rate has now improved to 72%, 73%. That's very good compared to 10 years ago. But we should not stop at this level. We should continue to create incentive to innovate and challenge. Can we find different ways to get the kids come to school, continue to raise our attendance rate beyond the 95%? If they don't come to school, they cannot learn, right? So we need to continue to create those incentives to innovate. So today I'm going to share with you one way to think about this school governance as an enabling entity. And so there are varieties. So when we talk about appointed boards, they are not one size fit all. They actually varies from district to district and from state to state. So here is just a list of examples of appointed boards. So for example, in New Haven and Hartford, it's a slightly hybrid, primarily appointed board, but they include 2 parents, representatives, elected across the city. So that's one model. But then on the other hand, you also have Chicago, Boston, New York, that is primarily appointed board. There are no elected parents, right? And another way to think about that is that there might be other processes at work that allow community input. For example, the 4th bullet here, Boston and Providence, they have nominating committees represented by the community's representatives, and they actually interview the potential school board, qualified school board applicants, and then they submit a list to the city council and the mayor's office and so on, and then they would then have to select from that qualified list of potential candidates and then put forward to the city council, and then approve and consent and so on. So there is a multi-step process that actually allow community to have multiple ways to provide their inputs. The whole design issue of appointed board is really to clarify accountability. So depending on the sources of the appointment, right, the sources could come from, say, the governor or the state superintendent or the state board or city council or the mayor. Regardless of what the source is, then we know that ultimately these entities are held accountable. If they are not putting their resources, if they are not putting their political capital behind the appointed school board, then we know that ultimately they are held accountable. But more importantly, as I said, the capacity to act is very important. Appointed boards usually could galvanize and to create a unified vision of action that attack system-wide challenges. For example, racial achievement gap, high level of school dropout factories, and things like that, or managing limited school finance. So how do we lobby the state legislature to make sure that they pay attention to the urban school district in terms of school funding. So those are the kind of system-wide challenges that appointed boards are oftentimes able to leverage the capacity to act. And also, I also found that there are a lot of initiatives on the part of the appointed boards to actually focus more on the lowest performing schools. And why is that? Because appointed boards feel that in order to move the whole system forward, they really need to push more school support services to those lowest performing communities. So I'm seeing some very interesting resource allocation decisions that I'm going to share with you in just a minute. There are different ways to get to the, and I think Mr. Gaines already mentioned that earlier, there are different ways to kind of think about how do we make an appointed school board happen. So different cities, different states have different ways to do it. Some would have to require state legislation, for example, Chicago, New York, and some would require citywide referendum, Cleveland. For example, Boston and Cleveland is very interesting. When they started the appointed board, the legislation, the city council approved the legislation. Okay, you are going to do it for 5 years. And then at the end of the 5 years, you're going to have a citywide referendum. And then they put it out in the ballot and let all the city residents decide whether they want to continue to endorse that going forward or not, or that they want to go back to an elected board. And in these two cases, they decided, the voters in Boston and Cleveland decided, look, after they review all the evidence and the progress made, they decided that, okay, they are going to continue this appointed system. In the case of Oakland, when Governor Brown, Jerry Brown, was the mayor in Oakland, Mayor Jerry Brown, he actually initiated a charter revision committee that proposed amendment to the charter so that he could appoint 3 members of the 9-member school board. So that's another model that I found. So there are different ways to analyze appointed board from a governing institutional perspective. There's just one example in terms of the variations of the appointive power. Because the image of appointed board is that some of us are concerned about checks and balances, right? That is, if you give an elected official, say the governor or the mayor, city council president, the power to appoint the school board, does that mean that we are, seeing a monopoly over centralization of power, right? So the question here is that yes and no, it depends on how you design the appointed governing system. So I just want to underscore that. It really depends on how you design it. And you can design it in such a way that the appointive power have to face checks and balances, such as the nominating committees. City council members would have to consent and advise and approve and reject. And in Providence, there were times when the nominees were put forward in a city council members rejected those, and then it came back to the nominating committee, and then they had to do it again. So it really depends on how we design that. And then there are some systems, for example, Baltimore up to early this year, and Philadelphia. These are the systems where they have share, or what we call joint governance system, where you have the governor and the mayor kind of share the appointive power. And so there kind of brings in some kind of checks and balances as well. So does appointed board raise student performance? A few years ago, I created a database with 104 largest urban school districts. And in that database of 104 urban school districts, it had about 15 appointed boards, and then the rest are elected board. So I used those, and then taking into consideration racial, ethnic, special education, ELL student population, taking into consideration those variation, what we call statistically control for those factors. And then we analyzed the fact that over a number of years, from 1998 to 2006 at the time when the data stopped, how did the appointed boards compare to the elected boards? So what I found is, I ran all kinds of statistical analysis, and this is a summary of the finding, is that statistically significantly, appointed boards showed a positive effect on student performance in reading as well as high school performance. And particularly important is that the lowest, what I call the lowest performing 20% of the schools in all these districts, when I look at comparing the lowest performers, the lowest performers in the appointed boards show the steepest increase in terms of the growth, in terms of academic growth over the years. And then academic progress are also associated with some checks and balances like school board nominating committee and city council approval and things like that. So there seems to be some very positive correlation between institutional checks and balances and school performance in the appointed board district. And so this is just a case study. So within that statistical analysis, if you disaggregate it, it's basically district by district and school by school, right? So this is just to show you what I was trying to capture, is that the vertical line was the before the appointed board in New York City and then after the appointed board in New York City. New York City, again, is a mixed appointed board because the appointed board members came from the mayor's office, but also from each of the borough presidents. So there are 4 of them. So each, so to speak, county is a smaller quasi-county president kind of appoint their school board as well. So it is an appointed board, but it comes from different sources. So what I'm seeing is that the blue line is the performance at that time, the 4th grade math achievement for the state of New York, using that state assessment. So you can see that the rest of the state, mainly consisting of non-urban districts, a lot of these are big suburban communities, and they are performing higher, the blue line. But then when you look at the appointed board in New York, under the appointed board, you see that they are inching up, and then it was closing the achievement gap between the city and the state. And so that's just one example how it's just one example of the findings that kind of, if I roll up these individual case findings, that's what the statistical trend show us comparing across the 104 urban school districts. And so another way to look at it is that the nation's report card, the Trial Urban District Assessment, National Assessment Education Progress, nation's report card also have a database of about 30 urban school districts, largest urban school districts, including both appointed and elected districts. And so I identified these 2 groups of districts, and then trying to see, okay, out of the latest 2015 to the NAEP assessment, how are these appointed system, function? And so it is particularly important to point out that compared to the urban district peers, these are all the 30s averaging, in the NAEP database, and I do find that, a number of these appointed boards are performing very well, and particularly interesting to see Washington, D.C. In recent years. They really show that they are outperforming their urban peers in terms of growth, academic growth rate, in a number of these measures. And what are these measures? It's not just reading and math, but these measures include subcategories of students. So I have African American students as a category. How are they doing in their 4th grade reading, 4th grade math, 8th grade reading, 8th grade math? How do the Latino students doing in these? And then compare the appointed board and the elected board. So what I'm seeing is that DC, New York, Boston, and Chicago, and so on are outperforming their peers in some of these categories. And then finally, I also look at the some of the more recent state assessment Particularly, I was interested in racial achievement gap, and so I zero in on New York City, which has the largest number of schools, which is the unit of analysis. And so I was able to look at the achievement gap in 4th and 8th grade and found that the appointed board, during the years of the appointed boards, the achievement gap narrowed for African American and Latino students. So why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is the allocation of resources. And I use the term strategic because resources are limited. Appointed boards are good at using data to drive their practice. So when they think about resource allocation, they understand that there's limited resources, but how do we make those resources work more effectively? And data is part of that, but also thinking about leveraging those resources that would enable teachers and principals to do their job better. And that's what I found is that for the appointed board districts, they're actually spending more on instruction because there have always been a concern that when you have appointed board, maybe they are no longer accountable, maybe they don't talk to parents, maybe they are distanced from classroom and community. And so that I pay particular attention to this question, that is that are they investing in teacher, staffing, instructional, student ratio, student-pupil ratio factors. And what I found is that they definitely are moving toward that direction. And what is also interesting, I found that they are moving more resources into student support services. And that's related to what I mentioned earlier in terms of mental health and trauma and really thinking about kind of the holistic environment to support learning and teaching. And so that's the strategic allocation of resources that I found. The other area is management. We know that large urban districts always have an easy relationship, between the unions, teachers' union, and management. Right? It's an ongoing issue. It has been going on since 1960, since the collective bargaining rights been granted. So it's a long history of that, and rightly so, because teachers' unions do have a place and do have a legitimate role to play. And so there have always been tension. So the interesting thing is that in the appointed board system, what I'm seeing is growingly, I'm seeing labor peace. Labor and management seems to be able to come to terms. And there are definitely fewer strikes going on these days than in the 80s and the 90s, and particularly in all these appointed board systems. I remember because I taught at U of Chicago for a number of years, and I lived in Chicago for 25 years. And in the 1980s, in the late 1980s through the mid and late 1990s, there were so many strikes, really a lot of strikes. And then after the appointed board kicked into the system, then we see that there are fewer and fewer strikes. And I think there were only one major one maybe about 3 years ago in Chicago. So finally, I just want to emphasize that appointed boards are also held accountable by the public because the officers that appoint the members of the board are held accountable through the electoral process. And here are just some examples. And I do feel that public matters through our direct democratic electoral system. And so, for example, in 2004, Detroit experimented the appointed board for a short period of time, and the voters didn't really think that it was a good idea, so they actually voted against it and then turned it back to an elected system. Cleveland and Boston, I mentioned earlier, they put it on the citywide ballot referendum, and the voters decided that, okay, we endorsed that, we wanted it to continue. And then the most interesting example is Mayor Adrian Fenty in Washington, D.C., and there was all kinds of lack of communication and frustration on the part of the communities. And community complained and protest, and share their concerns that, the system was not transparent, and we didn't know which school was subject to closing. We didn't know how the budget was allocated. And sure enough, Mayor Fenty was voted out of office, in large part because of the concern about the direction of the school district. And so these are real examples where officers are being held accountable and that voters have the choice to change direction or keep the direction or bring somebody new to actually govern the school system. So I do feel that the public counts and the public matters a lot. So from a broader perspective, appointed boards in kind of summarizing what I learned, some of the lessons learned in terms of what works, right, in the appointed board governance, is that I would classify them into two big areas of improvement. One is internal accountability. The other is external accountability. So the internal accountability is that we see a very functioning bureaucracy, a very functioning management system, and an accountability system under the appointed board. And so these are just some examples that I summarized that along the way as I was introducing to you some of my own research on strategic resource allocation, use of data to inform policy and practice, and building capacity and crossing the boundary, between silos and get everybody to be on the same page, right, and hold people accountable for that. External accountability is very important. I think oftentimes we feel that appointed boards, a lot of us might feel that the beginning of the appointed board is the end of democracy. And in fact, it is only the beginning of democracy because appointed board actually, from my research and my finding, actually appointed board shows that they are actually very strong in terms of building a structure and a process of external accountability. So among these, budgetary approval by City Council, as one example, nominating process, all kinds of potential community engagement checks and balances. But perhaps equally important on an ongoing basis is that appointed boards invite a lot of external and independent evaluation to check on their progress or lack of progress. And so they're audited. There are all kinds of research studies and evaluation done throughout those systems that I'm aware of. So the big lessons is that this is not a panacea. There's no silver bullet, as we all know, because urban schools are very complex. We need everybody to be a part of the solution. And so what we see is that appointed board has to be an active board. That is, that getting the appointment, getting a seat on the board is just the beginning. As we really need a proactive attitude. We want a can-do spirit. And I think getting the appointed board, at least the appointed board that I study, seem to be moving toward that direction, becoming a proactive board. And cities have to adapt to what we learn from research is that there is no one-size-fits-all. We really need to think about the situation in St. Louis. We need to think about what is good for the children of St. Louis. And even if the appointed board is successful at the beginning, there is an ongoing need not to be complacent, but instead build in a process of ongoing evaluation, learning, reflection, and improvement in order to make sure that the system continue to serve our children well. So coming back to the the second slide, and I introduced this notion that whatever governing model that you are going to bring to the city, I would urge you to think about these 5 drivers. That is the governing model serving your representational needs, serving the accountability aspiration, serving the capacity to act, creating opportunity to leverage partnerships so that the school district is not in isolation from the rest of the policy domains. And finally, are there incentives that the new governing system will be able to create and sustain for ongoing evaluation, self-reflection, and innovation. And finally, is there a collective will to make this work? Because once you set the model, it is very important to mobilize and sustain that mobilization so that we can all, take ownership of this new governance structure. And I thank you very much for your time, for listening. Thank you.
We will now begin with questions being asked by the committee of Dr. Wong. Dr. Wong, I will identify the people wanting to ask questions, and if you would respond. Reverend?
Dr. Wong, thank you so much for being here, and we appreciate your research, your information. You mentioned representation. Mm-hmm. Is there a process used typically or varied processes to choose among people with the limited number that a board can occupy with capacity? Is there a standard?
So usually across the appointed systems, there are 2 or 3 principles of practice. So number 1 is functional complementarity. So for example, in Chicago and Providence and Boston, so what they have done is to make sure that members of the school board as a whole would cover a number of critical areas. Obviously, legal issue, because we are talking about collective bargaining needs, and so legal expertise. Public finance, because we need to think about bond rating and capital improvement project and things like that, and obviously school budget. And community engagement piece. Usually the parents would play a very important role. So there are areas, and then higher education, there could be a connection. So former educators, former principals or professors or higher education representation. So first of all, the guiding principle is to make sure that the critical functional areas to do the basic kind of the response, fiduciary as well as legal and educational responsibility of the board would be fulfilled. So one is functional complementarity. So in other words, I did not see an appointed board with 5 financial experts. I don't see that. I usually see, 1 financial, 1 legal, 1 educator, a couple of parents, couple of community representatives. So there is the functional complementarity. Second one is geographic and neighborhood complementarity. I don't see that all the board members in the appointed governance arrangement come from certain area. So in Chicago, which is very diverse, and so I'm seeing representation from Latino, African American, South Side. I was a member of the South Side community for a long time. So there are strong representation from the South Side of Chicago, as well as the lakefront area, right? And so that's number 2, geographic and neighborhood representation. And the third one, I think, is racial ethnic diversity is very important. And that would include immigration status, linguistic and cultural diversity. So I'm seeing those 3 as kind of the guiding principles in a lot of the appointed boards. And so the process is that then we need to create a pool, right? Creating the pool of eligible, qualified candidates to be appointed. And different cities have different operating strategy. One big one is actually the nominating commission. The nominating committee would advertise in Latino newspaper and African American neighborhood newspaper and so on. And they just want to make sure that there's, the words get out there in public library and through word of mouth. And then we also see a lot of network going on, community-based organization. You kind of have to get the word out through those channels in order to get the broad pool, diverse pool of candidates. So the nominating commission would then go through that ask them to complete an application. So the school board or the entities, one of the entities would have to have it on either in the library, they can pick up a hard copy of the application to complete, or they would, so those are the basic stuff that I'm seeing. Yeah.
Follow-up. Why do you think that larger districts tend to use this model and smaller districts do not?
Yeah, so larger district, on my very first slide, larger district has unique challenges. And the number one challenge is concentration of high-need students. And we need the city to work together. There's no slack resources. We cannot have inefficiency to address the challenges of education in urban districts. So we need everybody to be on the same page. So a appointed board seems to, based on my research, seems to allow that to go forward and sustain it. So it's not just to create a vision and a unified collective commitment. How do you sustain it? That's the tough part. That is that a lot of school boards might be able to get together and agree on a unified vision today. But next year, there might be changes in elected school board members. There might be changes, and so that's one. Number two is that the turnover of school superintendent is too high from my perspective in urban district. The tenure of the school superintendent is very short, only about two and a half years, I think, on the average in urban district. Now, so imagine that if you're getting a new job, okay, the first 6 months, the first year, you get to know people, right? Get to build your relationship. Second year, you started doing some really important work. And then the following 6 months, they are reviewing your contract, and the elected board will say that, well, it's time for you to go. We are going to bring in another superintendent. So I think that a lot of the studies that I come across around the world, they look at the most effective education system, not only domestically, but around the world. What they found, one of the key factors is that the longer tenure of educational leader, the school superintendent, on the average, it should be seven years in order to actually bring, some real progress. Because otherwise, the first couple of years on the job training, then you kind of, get to know people, and then it's your time to leave. And I think that's another reason why I think the appointed board is helpful in large urban districts.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Ms. Hudson?
So in your research, you talked a little bit about, the purposes of putting together a governance board. And so I guess I'm trying to understand or wrap my arms around why we can't take some of the strategies from an appointed board and successfully implement them with an elected board. And an example is you talked about how an elected or appointed board can effectively allocate their resources better. They improve student-to-teacher ratios. Is there anything in your findings which points to why that strategy wouldn't be successful in an elected board?
Yeah, and I do agree that we can bring some of the strategies to the elected governance system. And in fact, I think the learning and the sharing of ideas and practices across different systems is very intense, actually. There are all kinds of networks. I think next Monday you'll hear from Michael, the Council of Great City Schools have both appointed and elected board members. So there are 75 members that actually share a lot of practices. And U.S. Conference of Mayors also share, National Government Association. So there are a lot of sharing of ideas, and that's happening, actually. And that is happening big time. And I, for one, been promoting, cross-sharing. That is, ideas and knowledge should not have a boundary, right? So we need to share that. There are a couple of reasons why I think appointed system is particularly helpful. in pushing for some of these factors is that number one is the what I call the fragmentation that I see in a lot of large urban districts. And if we have an elected board, elected boards are coming from a particular sub-district of the city, so a particular community or cluster of neighborhoods. So it is only natural that elected board members know their constituencies well and care about the needs of their constituency, and they will put higher priority, right? And that's only natural, and that's understandable. And so structurally speaking, there's always been a very close relationship. There's the elected school board member would talk to the superintendent and then ask for certain projects or certain services that pertain to their particular neighborhood needs. And so so that gets to point number two, is that imagine that the superintendent then would be getting, if we have a 7-member board or 5-member board, then each individual board member should call the superintendent to ask the superintendent to pay attention to his or her community. So the superintendent's time would have to be allocated, and in fact, that's what a lot of superintendents have been telling me when I interview them in terms of their relationship with the school board members. And so the attention, the time allocation is very precious, and the superintendent would have to deal with demands and preferences coming from all different directions, right? And then the third one is the contract for the superintendent, because elected board, oftentimes there might be cluster of votes. So in an elected board of 5 people or 7 people, it could be a 4-3 today, supportive of superintendent. But next year, after a different election, it could be the other way around. It's a 3-4. So the superintendent's job is in jeopardy. So that explains why the superintendent's tenure is so short, from my perspective, 2.5 years and counting. And so the appointed board would be able to resolve some of those differences and push a unified vision in the contract negotiated with the superintendent instead of firing the superintendent. So that's how I see it. Yeah.
So I have
Mr. Pruitt.
I have a few questions, but I would like you to go back to your last slide.
Okay.
And that very last bullet point.
Which one?
The very last
Oh,
bullet
yeah.
point. So can a appointed board perform and exist without that? And if so, why?
Okay. Can a appointed board?
Yes, it
Yeah.
says, is there collective will and public support to enact and implement meaningful governance change? And I'm saying that, can an appointed board be successful without the public support and its collective will? Can they, because I'm assuming you're saying this period, this has to exist
Yeah.
in an appointed board. So can they be successful without this, and if why? And in addition, at the appointed boards you looked at, did the research on, did all of them possess this?
Yes. So, I can say a little bit about this issue. So what I'm trying to point out here is regardless of whether we are talking about an elected or an appointed board, I think to make sure that we have broad public support is important. Because even for an appointed board, we need the public support, right? So that's why I put it there, is that ultimately, this is a democratic institution, and we want the broad-based public commitment to public education. And the agent to do the work is the board. So we are agent of the people. So we are appointed here, if we are talking about an appointed board, we are appointed here because we have certain reasons to be here, expertise and racial representation and so on. and neighborhood representation. But the important thing is that we are agent of the children. We're agent of the people. So that's why I want to put it in here, to make sure that we keep this, we don't forget about this relationship between the board and the people of the city, right? Now, elected board, we also need to think about this, because elected board, as I said, elected board are elected by a particular segment of the population. Each members represent primarily a segment of the population. That's why I underscore the collective aspect of the public will. That is that, can we overcome and can we make sure that, yes, we are elected by a segment or particular neighborhood of the population, but then can we set aside some of our differences or some of our preferences or some of our demands so that we can then work together as a collective entity, to support the,
But did any of the appointed boards that you looked at, did any of them lack public support? And if so, how did they perform?
Yeah. So right now, the one that, so it's interesting. So the example that I gave earlier, Washington, D.C., right? Mayor and Adrian Fenty. So there was a period when he actually had a lot of public support during the first couple of years when he started implementing the appointed board. But then during his last year, his public support declined. So by the time it gets to the election, the declining public support then basically converted into a vote for his opponent. So they elected his opponent to be the next mayor, and so they voted Mayor Fenty out of office.
Mr. Chairman, I maybe you don't understand my question. My question is, again, did you find that any of the appointed boards lacked public support? And if they did not, how did they perform?
Yeah, they did not lack public support. The one that is functioning right now, they've got the public support.
All of the ones you looked at
Yes.
had public support?
Yes, yeah. What I was trying to explain is that it comes through different channels. The public support could be articulated, through the electoral process. That's one, right? But then there are other channels where public support would be articulated. And actually, a lot of times as for example, the editorial in the newspaper or public opinion polls, there are a lot of very interesting information across different cities on public support.
I have a follow-up question to that. How do you, Dr. Wong, how do you define public support?
Yeah, yes. So that gets to the mechanism of public support. So one is the electoral process. And I think that's I would say that is a basic, I would consider it as a basic mechanism.
So the turnout for the mayor?
Yeah.
How many people support the mayor?
Yes.
Is how you define public support?
Yes.
Oh.
To vote, to continue to re-elect, for example, just recently, right, just this week on Tuesday, I think, Mayor de Blasio in New York City and the mayor in Boston, they were re-elected. And if you look at their campaign, they talk a lot about education. And de Blasio, for example, invested at the appointed board under his direction. It's not entirely his appointed. There are some other appointed members coming from other sources. The appointed board actually invested in all-time full-day kindergarten initiative, and that was a very important initiative that the voters really liked. And so he got a very, very high voters turnout as well as very high public support in that regard.
We have a telephone question from Mr. Meredith. Mr. Meredith is a part of this. As I indicated, he is now in California with one of his children, but he's live streaming this. His question is,
if appointed boards show improvement, and the SAB has been governing SLPS for many years. Have we seen the same rise? Obviously, we've become accredited, but what about with our student scores and things like that? Do you do any research on that?
Yeah, so a couple of the slides that I went through, looking at different assessment over the years. So there are definitely, we need to look at graduation rates. And I did not show here, but the graduation rates for the appointed boards are also improving. And I know that the under SAB has improved from maybe 62% to 72% in terms of graduation rate. And so that's another example. So graduation rate is one indicator that particularly in the last few years, there is now a nationwide standard in measuring high school graduation. Many years ago, different states, different districts used different measures, but now there's a uniform standard. So you can compare across system between the appointed and the elected board system. So that's one. Graduation rate to me is very important because we are talking about preparation of children and high school students to be college and career ready. So we are moving into that kind of arena. So graduation rate, I think, is very important. And then there are two other indicators that I mentioned. One is the NAEP data, the National Education Progress data, and that's also comparable across all the 30 urban school districts that show that they are improving not only for the district as a whole, but for particular subpopulation. And I mentioned low-income student as well as Latino and African-American students in those districts. And the third one is the state assessment, which is the, up to this point, primarily standardized test scores, which may or may not be the best indicator, but that's all we have. Usually I would look at the gap between the state average and the district progress. So the chart that I show in terms of New York City, are we catching up? Are the urban district catching up with their state average? I think that would be a good benchmark going forward for us to continue to track how we are doing in the appointed board.
Can you ask Mr. Meredith whether or not his question has been sufficiently answered?
Thank you.
Much better than I am.
He probably knows what we're saying.
We're going to have Ms. Cooksey. This will be her first time. Her first question was relationship to Mr. Pruitt's question. Ms. Cooksey.
Can you go back to your first slide?
Okay.
It states.
All the way?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Not the cover page, but.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
So you mentioned some of the unique challenges for
Yes.
urban school systems.
Yeah.
And it states that one of them includes low turnout for school board elections. So I was looking at some of the data for our city
Oh, okay.
to compare.
Yeah.
And so the Democratic primary really is what counts for mayoral elections in the city. So for our current mayor, she received about 17,000 votes, and one of our school board members received 26,000 votes.
Sounds good.
So would you say that that point isn't valid or relevant in this case?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, what I'm looking at is across a lot of these cities, right? And I'm glad that you pointed that out. But so I congratulate everybody that, this is good turnout. I think it's very important to keep up the high voters turnout. Like I said, regardless of whether you are going to go forward with an elected board, and I see some elected board members here, and I congratulate you with the high voters turnout, or the appointed board. I think the important thing is also, so first of all, it's very good to hear that. I'm heartened by that. And equally important is that I would like to see if a system can be designed to sustain that. And so going forward, if there are ways that the governing system can push out information, encourage, voters turnout, getting more volunteers, across the entire city to do it. I think that would be very good.
So you're saying if we have consistent,
Yeah.
strong voter turnout for school board
Yeah.
elections, that makes a case for not focusing as much on the idea of an appointed board?
I'm not saying that yet, because what I'm saying is that this is one indicator that I look at the nature of our governing system. And there are obviously many indicators, right? And so maybe one school board member is getting a lot of votes because she is extremely popular, right? Extremely articulate, and run a very strong platform and really, energize the community. But other board members may not have those kind of skills, right? Or may not have the same kind of receptivity, among the public. So I think there are, so in other words, the elected boards, the elected system allow us to appreciate the variation. There's a tremendous amount of variation between board members, among the board members. One board members may be extremely good in creating a very strong campaign finance to know how to raise money, but may run a very limited campaign. Only, other members may be able to use social media very effectively. So there is a lot of variation, I think. So we'll just have to take a closer look at that. But I agree that, that's a good sign that we have such a strong voters turnout, which is important.
I just want to clarify some of my the data I share. Actually, in the last election, all three three of them had higher turnouts, our support than our mayor.
Okay, great. So that's very good to know. Yeah.
That it, Ms. Cookson? Mr. Cummings?
Thank you, Mr. Gaines. Professor Wong, I've been studying your research for the past decade, since 2007, and it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I did want to...
Same here.
Yes. I did want to share with you for the record that our elected board members are not in sub-districts. They're elected at large across the city.
Yeah.
My question is specifically concerning the integrated governance. Maybe it's about in your third slide. And also, before I get to my question, you had on the slide governors and mayors or both, and politicians like that, they too have a constituency, and it's people who finance their campaigns.
Yes.
So they focus on their constituents also.
Yeah.
My question with respect to integrated governance has to do with whether you're a governor or a mayor. During your 4 years in office, and sometimes 6 years, you may have made thousands of decisions and have affected various areas of the city or something like that. You know what I'm saying? And I'd just like for you to share with me how you feel so confident that that will in turn be electoral accountability, since many times voters aren't necessarily a one-issue voter.
So first of all, I appreciate the point that all the officers, include citywide or system-wide or statewide officers, they also have their constituencies, right? But what I'm trying to make a point here is that the scale of the constituencies encompasses a broader kind of a jurisdictional area, so that it is a summation of a lot of diverse interests and a lot of diverse constituencies, so that the appointed board would then be able to have I would say a higher likelihood of thinking about the needs of the system as a whole. instead of just focusing on their own neighborhoods and their communities, right? And so when we talk about focusing on the lowest performing schools, say, to really address this problem of achievement gap, my research just shows that the appointed boards are more likely to allocate resources to the lowest performing 20% of the schools as compared to the elected board. So that's just one example that so if we have everybody just thinking about their own community, then if I'm coming from a community and I'm representing a community where my schools are doing fine, I might vote against that for the right reason. I might think that, well, my community is doing fine, but I want to bring in a science lab. I want to bring in another library or things like that to my community. I would want to question whether we want to allocate more resources to support the lowest performing 20% of the school. So that's just my way of just capturing the research that I'm seeing. So that's what it is.
Once again, I'd like to
Yeah.
remind you that
Yeah.
they're elected at large across the whole
Yes,
community.
yes.
My other part is I'm a science teacher, and as I said, I've read a lot of your research
Yeah.
and all of that. And you have made some substantial claims here for advantages for the appointed board. And I would just ask you for those claims, if you could provide us with your underlying research on that.
Yeah. I could give you some references and citation and yeah.
Okay, I'd
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Sure,
Thank
yeah,
you.
Yeah, sure, yeah. And I appreciate that because I think that's what it is about. Because a lot of times when we do research, researchers, even among researchers who agree on a general point, we use different measures. And we have different time frame, right? And we have different sample. So sometimes we just talk about the work that we focus on, but then when they try to transfer the knowledge to a different setting, there might be some limitation too. So I appreciate that question. Yeah.
Any other members of the panel that have questions?
Yes.
Mr. Holloman.
Thank you. So in our city, in our region, people are really hesitant to change and transition, and we have our good reasons for that. Have you noticed in your research where a appointed board reverted back to an elected board, and there was shortly thereafter there was immediate, let's say, downfall of a district? Because I believe that's part of hesitation that people may be feeling, or part of fear. And I actually posed this scenario to my students, and they said that was one of the biggest issues that they would have if they were of an elected age, or if they were able to participate in the process. If they had a say-so, they would be afraid to a dramatic decline, just simply because people are just afraid that when you change things or when you transition, things may not go the way you want. So in your research, when a appointed board reverted back to an elected board, what has been the likelihood of an immediate downfall of a district?
There are a couple of examples that I could point to, and I have not done extensive research, but I know a little bit about that. And one is Detroit, and in 2002, so they had maybe 4 or 5 years of an appointed board, and then they reverted to an elected board, 2002, and the elected board was not able to turn around the system, so ultimately it actually invited the state to take over the school system by appointing, not appointing a state board, not appointing an appointed board, but actually set up a kind of an emergency manager. That's the term that they use, emergency manager, to take over the whole enterprise of the district. So that's one story that I would encourage you to take a closer look. And again, I haven't followed that, but most recently, after a period of kind of state takeover and administrative control, Now it's turning back to an elected board, but with reduced number of schools, and I think they were under some kind of a negotiated settlement.
And this is all in Detroit, right?
Yeah.
And earlier you mentioned how the
Yeah.
people of Detroit, I believe you said actually voted out the
Yeah.
SAB, so they had
Yeah,
some type of
2002,
power.
yeah.
And then it was given to an elected board.
Yeah.
And then it was then given to an
The
emergency.
state emergency manager. Yeah.
And now it's back to an elected board.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But a somewhat different kind of elected board. The size of the districts have changed significantly because the state also created a lot of charter schools. And so they basically take away, over the process of state management, they actually took away a lot of the schools and turned them into independent charter schools. So it's a very interesting governance story that we should all take a look at.
Thank you.
Ms. Hudson for the second time.
So you talked a couple of times in your presentation about, how the students have academically performed once an appointed board has taken over. And if I'm understanding you correctly, their academic performance increases. And so my question is twofold, actually. It's number one, since we have enough data going back to at least 98 or 99, do we have any data in your research that shows whether or not that performance continues to increase or if it levels off? Or does it at some point match the performance level of elected boards? And then the second part to that is, and I guess this is what the discrepancy that I'm trying to reconcile in my mind, we heard in a different presentation, and I don't mean to ask you to opine on that research, that, somewhere around 96% of school districts have an elected board. And so I guess I'm trying to understand if we are seeing higher performance, closing the gap, why are we not seeing elected boards or school districts with elected boards switch over to appointed boards? So I know that's a compound question, but if you could answer those.
Yeah. So the last part first, my understanding is that there are state laws, and it depends on the state statute. There's whether there is, and like I said, whether there is a process that would enable the district to turn from an elected to an appointed board. If the state legislature is not ready to do it for various reasons, in the earlier discussion with Mr. Cummings, we talk about state legislature as their own constituency too, right? So they might be thinking about a completely different set of agenda rather than thinking about governance in the urban district. So that's one reason that I'm seeing that why there are. The other reason is the district boundary is interesting. East of the Mississippi, a lot of the districts have the city boundary and the district boundary the same, coterminous. And that's why I'm seeing a lot of the district on the eastern seaboard that kind of overlap, because it makes sense for the city to work with the school board. And so it facilitates this sharing of resources and information and work together for a unified district-wide, city-wide vision, right? And but then if you go to district over in the West Coast in California, for example, there are a lot of districts that are multi-cities, or one city is being split into different part of a district, right? So it creates additional kind of a legislative hurdle to actually get, for example, in California, the Los Angeles Unified really wanted to move toward an appointed board, but it was stopped by the Supreme Court because it's against the state constitution to actually have an appointed board in the LA Unified area for various reasons. So there are some very interesting state-specific reasons why that. But I think your question is very important, because I do see a growing interest and commitment on the part of citywide officials, city council members or the mayors and so on, or city manager, that they are showing that they would like to work more closely with the school district. So from Nashville, Tennessee, to some of the county managers in Maryland and mayors in Connecticut, you see that they are actually they are now spending a lot more time talking about their commitment to education. So occasionally I did analysis on for example, the state of the city messages and also, city resolution, things like that. And I'm seeing that a lot of the cities, for example, Louisville, the mayor is a county system, right? Louisville is a pretty big county metro system. And the mayor is committed to the 80,000 diploma project. And so he's actually working very closely with community colleges, school system, and universities to actually work together to push that. So I'm seeing a lot of interest and demonstrated interest with a lot of paperwork to back that up, that a lot of these citywide and countywide officials are now moving more and more toward their education policy. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
the data again, how the students in the appointed,
Yeah.
where there's an appointed board, how they're measuring up against
Yeah.
the students in the elected, in districts where there are elected
Yeah. So,
boards?
so the first set of data was from 1998 to 2006, right? So there's actually a book that I published, and I'll give you the citation, and then you can check out all the data and the statistical analysis and so on. So, and then the second wave is that because it takes a lot of time to complete a book-length project. So the second wave was that then I do a sequel to the book and then bring the data up to around 2012, right? And that's published by the Center for American Progress. It's on the website, so everybody can check that out. And then, so that's up to 2012 that I use some of these data to look. And then more recently, I'm in the process of updating that again. And so the data that I just showed you is actually ongoing work right now. I'm using the 2015 data. I'm using the 2015, which is quite recent. And so, if I synthesize, the trend that I'm seeing, right, from 1998 to, so there are 3 bodies of analysis, and I'm seeing pretty consistent trend that the appointed board is narrowing the achievement gap, and they are outpacing some of their peers in the NAEP database.
And so, based on what you're seeing, are you expecting that the data will show that the students in this appointed district will eventually surpass their peers, or will they just become even? Will the data stagnate and level out? What do you think the trend, where is it headed?
Yeah, that is a very good question. It is a difficult question to answer right now because it's difficult to predict for a number of reasons. One is that and that applies to all the governance structure, not just the appointed board, in general. And that is the school governance structure I mentioned, it has to be proactive because our students keep coming in with different needs. And so, for example, Providence, the city that I'm living right now, and there has been in the last 5 years, there's a significant increase of ELL students, just in the last 5 years. So if I stopped the analysis 5 years ago, that's a different story, but then moving forward, right, and how do they handle the growth in the ELL needs, right? And in Florida and a lot of communities right now, because of the situation in Puerto Rico, they are getting, an influx of needs from the Puerto Rican community, and they need to find ways to address them. And so, governance have to be proactive on an ongoing basis, and then they have to fine-tune, continue to change their strategy. And so if appointed board cannot change their strategy, say, they will be behind. So I would not be surprised that if appointed board cannot, continue to think about strategic resource allocation like the findings that I mentioned, or external accountability, they are going to be behind. So then we'll have to revisit, well, maybe it's not a good idea, right? So I think the fact that I'm seeing the appointed board, that they seems to be able to be in front of the issues, at least up to this point, based on the research, that gave me the confidence that they are likely to meet those challenges. Yeah.
Mr. Pruitt, for the second time.
You mentioned that the appointed boards were better at enabling the teachers and the parents. Can you give me some examples of some of the ones you looked at on what they were doing that made them more proficient at enabling, especially as it relates to enabling teachers?
Yes. So some concrete example is from Chicago Public School. So so immediately after the appointed board took its place, I'm seeing that the creation of what they call the Teacher Academy. So they would create a citywide professional development hub for teachers to come and learn from other teachers, innovative practices. And at the time, one of the examples was that, do we need to teach biology first before we teach physics and chemistry, or can we reverse it? And so there was a big kind of a debate going on in that Teacher Academy. Those are the kind of opportunities where I am, and I'm capturing, in some of these appointed boards. And then the Principal Academy is also very, being pushed out big time. And then the other area that I see is also from Chicago is that because of the parental engagement at the school level, they have the local school council and represented by parents and teachers. But school governing at the school site require a lot of training. So there has been a lot of citywide funding to support organizations that do all kinds of training so that teachers at the school site and parents at the school site are able to actually make use of those kind of materials and training opportunities to think about how they make their decisions at the school site. So those are just some example. And then in Philadelphia for a while, so when Arlene Ackerman was the school superintendent, she started the Imagine 2000, and then she started talking about pushing more holistic support. That is, the teachers cannot do it by themselves. And so she created additional fundings to move in the school so that teachers work with social workers and community organizations to actually create the kind of a team-based supportive environment. Now, this is nothing new if you look at, say, a country like Finland. Finland and some other countries, the reason why they are very successful, according to international measures, is because they create those kind of school-based social instructional support team, that the teachers talk to social worker, talk to mental health specialists so that they can compare notes to map out the individualized learning program.
Okay, we're going to have one more question from the panel, and then we will move to the audience for questions.
Okay. So I apologize if I missed some of this information, but I did have some thoughts about why were these appointed boards put in place in the first place? Are they similar to the St. Louis situation where the state took over and then the appointed boards were put in place? And then I have a second question that's not as related, but about what size are appointed boards compared to elected boards that you may have been studying?
Okay. Okay. So yes, they were in. So different state legislation have different terminology. So sometimes it's called academic bankruptcy. Sometimes it's academic financial stress. And so usually they lost some accreditations, some measures like that. And so So it was usually on the verge of being under some kind of receivership. Actually, the case in Chicago is interesting. The Chicago was under state receivership for over 10 years before they moved into the locally appointed board system. And so in a way, it is an interesting story because finally the state decided that, okay, after these 10 or so, 12 years of receivership, there are all these indications that you are able to earn your accreditation back. And so maybe you should think about, the next phase of local school governance. And so Chicago turned to the appointed board system, right? And so usually there are triggers based on the legislation at the time. So the trigger lead to a series of steps and ultimately lead to the community to get together to say that, well, we want local control. Can we create the appointed board? So Philadelphia story is the same thing, and that is that the 2001 kind of a takeover state legislation identified Philadelphia as in need of some major intervention. And the governor really wanted to have a hostile takeover. But then the mayor at the time negotiated a settlement with the governor and said, well, why don't we agree to appoint, okay, you appoint 3 people, I will appoint 2 people, and why don't we have shared governance? So that's how it goes.
Ms. Cooksey has a short question for her third time.
Yeah.
My second time. The follow-up one doesn't count, I don't think.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's any relationship between the rise of charter schools and the increased prevalence of appointed boards. It seemed like both of those became a more prominent focus in the 1990s.
Okay, it's interesting. Now, way back in the 19th, so the first appointed board in large city was Boston, 1992. And if you recall, Al Shanker, president of AFT, well-known, well-respected educator, he championed the notion of charter school, and he started the very first charter school in St. Paul in a shopping mall for school dropouts, 16 kids, and wanted the charter school to be a laboratory. So 1989 was really the first time that charter became. So some of these earlier wave of appointed boards was not happening in a period where we identify charter school as kind of a market-based strategy. So the earlier phase of charter school was less of a market-based, right? So I would say that from 1990s all the way to late 1990s or early 2000, the charter school, a lot of them are homegrown charter school, former teachers and educators from the public district wanted to try out some new ideas. They wanted to take some risk and felt that the environment was not supportive of risk-taking, so they wanted to try it out. So that was the period where we saw Boston, Chicago, and I think 2001, 2002 is New York City, Cleveland, 1995. So there were a bunch of appointed boards that kind of happened around that time. Now, more recently, of course, we are talking about charter management organization and things like that. So it's a little bit different in terms of the so-called portfolio, diverse service provider portfolio management system.
And I have a very quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
So looking at, I believe it's a quote from you, where it said diverse providers and charter schools should be involved in where it said that one promising approach to strengthening student outcomes was the use of charter schools. So I'm wondering, do you believe mayoral control is a way to increase charter school expansion?
Yeah. So there are 2 sets of consideration. One is charter schools are state creation. So a lot of time the state would have to enable the district to enable the city or enable the charter school to expand, right? So right now there are a lot of states that have charter school caps on both the campuses as well as the enrollment. So charter might be able to expand within the existing structure by maybe adding a kindergarten grade or expanding from a middle to high school. So that could happen. So the other consideration is that some of the appointed boards that I'm aware of like to look at charter school as an opportunity to address some of the needs of students. So charter school, because of the fact that they are able to innovate and try out different ideas, they might be able to come up with particular thematic areas. For example, in Providence, we have a charter school that is almost like this school here is a Trinity Performing Arts for the charter school. It's a very small charter school, but every teacher have to be able to perform either musical, singing, vocal, or instrument, or dance. And then the students who come to the charter school also are expected to be able to make use of that as a program of study, right? So charter school are very good at doing those kind of more customized, innovative practices. And so a lot of the appointed boards that I'm aware of definitely, thinking about encouraging some of these charter schools to meet some of the particular learning interests of the students.
Thank you. We will now go to audience questions and comments. I remind your audience of speaker rules. Sign in at the registration table. Speakers will be called in order. We will remain until every speaker has been called. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes. State and spell your name before speaking. 3 minutes. Okay. Again, that's 3 minutes. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes. Again, if Miss Miss Chelsea Addison is here tonight, she gets to speak first. At Monday night's meeting, she was the last person to sign up to speak, but was inadvertently overlooked. If Ms. Addison is here tonight, please come forward to a microphone to give your comment and/or question. Ms. Addison.
Hi. Yes, so first I would like to address the comment made about Finland. I do not view the comparison of Finland and the States as one that's fair for several reasons. One, they're homogenous society and teachers are held to a much higher regard as they are in comparison to what they are in the States. And I just want to put that out there because there's a lot of conversation around that. But I'm a newly elected board member in the University City School District. And much of our training, and initially from MSBA or Missouri School Board Education, details the do's and don'ts on how to be effective school board members during our terms. With continued education, we expand on the do's by taking into consideration evidence-based research and feedback from our constituents. We are reminded to leave implicit biases to a specific sector of the community at the door in order to serve all children within our districts and how doing so can positively impact our districts. This includes but is not limited to what our role is as a board member and how we can negatively impact our districts with certain behaviors such as being divisive or not working as a team, or also not allowing the superintendent to do his or her job. With this notion, the speaker spoke highly, where are we? The speaker spoke highly of an appointed board and their means of impacting positive change in a district. However, there is a lot of conversation with an elected board member training around good board governance behavior to positively impact change as well. As we heard Monday, there are elected boards who practice good board governance, who make successful positive changes in their districts as well. Is there any research comparing the successful good board governance or good governing boards in comparison to successful appointed boards? And are those positive gains and impact in similar areas, such as academic, community involvement, and so have you? And are there limitations to this as well? And is there any research of group dynamics within appointed boards and how this can impact a district? We talk a lot about within elected boards how sometimes group dynamics can impact the district. And so when you see the appointed boards, is there any impact that can make this negative as well? The way I see it is no matter what you have, whether it's a group of people, you're not always going to get along. But if you all come into it with the notion of we're coming here to impact the lives of children positively and are following good governing behaviors, then you will see positive change. And so how does that compare to appointed boards versus elected?
Yeah, I agree with your overall comments, and I think good governance is very important, and also the commitment to impact the life chances of children is extremely important. And I do see, regardless of whether we are talking about elected or appointed board members, I see a lot of passion, a lot of commitment on the part of both sides. And so that's a big plus in terms of the people who are willing to give to this very important public service. The one thing that I am thinking about is that the reason why I'm thinking about what I presented today is that in the group dynamics that you talk about, I think is very important, and that is that in the appointed board, because of the complementarity of the functional expertise and also the purposeful diversity that built into the appointed board membership, that kind of allow the entity as a whole to actually move toward the opportunity to share the expertise and to learn from one another, and then come to some kind of a unified agreement. And instead of driven by factors that might be disproportionately leaning towards certain areas. So like I said, if we have a board, I'm an educator, so if we have a board that is consisted of university educators, that doesn't work as well as a board that actually cover all the functional areas. So that's kind of the purposeful by design, yeah.
Byron Clemens, Max Maxider, and Lou Moy.
Good evening, and I want to thank the task force. I have a review for you, Mr. Gaines. When I'm finished, I'd like to present it to you so you can make copies for the task force. It's a peer review of Dr. Wong.
Let me just stop you for 1 minute. We have received letters from people who have not participated and were not here on Monday. We received letters, all of us have, from people who have basically begun writing in their positions and their opinions. All of that will be shared as we finalize this process. We welcome your document.
Okay. I hope my time starts over again. No. This is a peer review of Dr. Wong's research, and I'll just quote one part of it. It says, the report offers useful information about the context for shifts in mayoral control in different cities and the challenges that may arise in such governance changes. The limitations, however, preclude relying on either the report's findings or its recommendations in making any policy decisions. It's a good review, and I recommend that everybody share it and take a look at it.
We'll reproduce it and see that everyone gets a copy of it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I want to thank Mr. Gaines for his service on both the elected board and the appointed board. There are things we've worked on together, and I appreciate that. One is his advocacy for pre-K expansion. That was a good decision, and I appreciate it. Keeping classroom sizes at the desirable standards. That's a great thing to do, and I thank you for that. Finding funding for the schools. I applaud that. Thank you. The St. Louis plan, supporting teachers in the classroom. That was a great thing to collaborate with the local AFT affiliate on. We appreciate it. At the last meeting, it appeared that the 10 years of frustration people have had about not being able to vote for the elected board was directed at you. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think people meant that personally. I really don't feel like it was a personal attack on you. You just happen to be the person at the podium. Saying that, people are emotional about the disenfranchisement of not being able to vote. It seems wrong. For some of my questioning of Dr. Wong, I'd like to ask, and at the end of my comments, please answer some of the questions. Are there any school districts that have had appointed board that are majority white? Are there any? and the 100 that you've studied, you could just answer, I guess, now. Are there any school districts that are majority white that have been taken over by an appointed board?
I need to double check, but I think Prince George's County could be one of them.
In Maryland?
Yeah, in Maryland. Yeah, I'll have to double check and see. Yeah.
We had a presenter last week who
Yeah.
will know the answer to that
Yeah,
question.
yeah, exactly. So we should all take a look at it.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks.
My sincere hope that Mr. Gaines' legacy is going to be about pre-K in St. Louis. Last week, I learned a lot from that presentation from the MSBA and the NSBA, and it's already been mentioned once again this evening that 96% of school boards in the United States are all elected. I think that's worth noting. The U.S. once had appointed boards. We learned this on Monday. The appointed boards were taken away by a progressive reform movement to remove.
Mr. Clemens, I'm
Yes.
going to have to say your time has expired. I did give a few more seconds because of
Thank you. I
my
appreciate
asking.
that. I appreciate that. The reform movement of the 19th century was to put in elected boards to remove politics. And in the research review of Dr. Wong's research, you'll see his research constantly reflects on inserting Republican politics into the process. He is represented and funded by right-wing think tanks, and I think that taints his research. And I think the science will show the same thing.
Thank
you
you
very much.
Max Either, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrect. Next will be Lou Moy, and following him will be Bob Topping.
Yes, good evening, and thank you all for your participation. Dr. Wong, thank you. And a question to Counselor Dalton, and your law firm escapes me, but who are you representing? The state?
No, he represents...
I represent this committee.
You're representing the committee. But you did say something to the effect that the ultimate decision will still come from some entity in the state of Missouri? Was I correct in
No, that's not correct.
Well, who is going to, okay, first of all, I'm here, I know that's going to sound kind of trite, but I'm here to speak for democracy. And I won't waste your time in saying anything cheeky like, why don't we try this the appointed reps out in Parkway or places like that. I won't waste your time talking about that sort of thing, making cute little, equivalencies and that, because I don't think the folks out in Parkway School District would stand for it. But what I'm concerned with, we've had our democracy taken away from us in voting for the board. Who will decide that the democracy in voting for our school board is returned to us? In other words, who will have that vote? Because under Dr. Wong's model, appointed members of the board, yes, someone votes for that, but only one or two people. So I still believe, even with all the lack of participation, and we saw what happened recently, less than 20% turnout, to vote for Proposition P, even with lack of participation in our democracy, all over and just representing the school board, I would still prefer that as to someone somewhere, maybe someone that I'm in favor of, one person voting that I know what's good for you, I'm going to vote for it. So now, explain to me once again, who will make this decision in returning our democracy? And sorry for my voice.
Mr. Gaines, you want me to?
John,
I'm done.
I will speak to that in terms of the way it is supposed to function. We make a recommendation. That's all we do. We meaning the SAB. We have asked this panel to come before you and to listen to the speakers, listen to the different forms of government. They will then say to us, this is what we think your recommendation to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education should be. It should be, we believe that it should be, the school system should be run by a, quote, elected board or an appointed board or a hybrid, which would be a combination of the two, and if there's something else out there, that as well. So these meetings are basically to allow this community to be able to say, we like this, we don't like this, this is what we want, here is why we like it. So we're bringing people who are well steeped into what it means to have the different kinds of boards, so people can question them on that. So the process goes like this. This committee, as well as, will make a recommendation to us. Beginning on the 18th, I think it is, we will go live with a survey. That survey will include responses from students, educators, people who live in this community, parents, etc. We have an existing mailing list of over 10,500 people this survey will go out to. The returns on that survey and others who choose to participate in that survey will be basically accumulated by the consultants, Vector Communications. They will basically scrub the information, determine how many people said they wanted this, how many people said they wanted that, how many people said they wanted this. Now, I will remind you, we are not suggesting this is a scientifically structured survey. We're simply getting information from throughout this region, probably 95% from the city, from city residents. What do you think? Once we get that information in and it's a symbol, it will be then used by this panel before you first to look through the summary of it and say, based on what people have said, based on what we have heard, individual information that we have been able to glean on our own, we recommend to you, SAB, that you make this recommendation. We make a recommendation. Our recommendation goes directly to DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for the state of Missouri. They then make a decision. Which way should this go? Appointed board, elected board, or a hybrid? Now, let me be very clear, and I'm going to be as clear with this as I can to the audience here as well as those listening. And incidentally, Monday night, we had 262 people to sign in here. We had over 1,600 people who streamed what was basically dealt with on Monday night, every part of it. What will happen is DESE will make a decision. They can make one of really 3 decisions from the way we understand this. If they decide that they want this district to be run again by an elected board, all they have to do is say that and talk about when that change would happen. However, and we've had some state representatives here who, and I hope they are aware of this, if they decide, if DESE decides we do not want an elected board, that will require legislation. And that legislation would come from the state legislature if, in fact, they decide they do not want to basically go back to an elected board. That is the process.
Okay. Well, thanks again, sir. I would still prefer to vote on it. I don't trust our legislature, but I didn't want to get into this. And Mr. Dalton, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next, we will have Lou Moy, followed by Bob Topping, and then Megan Betts.
Good evening. First, let me just thank the task force for volunteering your service for this important question. And I also like to thank the SAB under the leadership of you, Brother Gaines, for all your years of service and dedication to our students. And give a special thanks to the elected board who have stayed the course during all this time. And we appreciate you as well. In a democratic society where taxpayers are allowed to elect those who governs, I think it's a pretty big ask to ask those same citizens to give up that right. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's insulting, especially to those who have, in many cases, given their lives for the right to vote and to choose their representation. So in a lot of ways, it's insulting to ask those to give that up, to not to be able to elect those from their community. My question is, Dr. Wong, are we seeing a trend, or are we seeing trending where appointed boards, the decision to govern by appointed boards are made in urban areas where there are large concentrations of African Americans or other minorities, and failure of students in a lot of ways are related to poverty? Are we seeing that trend in this country? That's the question.
Clearly, there is a high correlation between concentration of poverty and education performance. And so that is the clear challenge in our commitment to reduce inequality. And there is a lot of new research that actually shows that that kind of correlation is so high that we really need to have more comprehensive strategy. So that gets to the appointed board. And part of what I'm learning from the appointed board in terms of the practices and strategies is that they are able to leverage this kind of commitment and partnership with entities outside of schools. So there is now conversation in Philadelphia and some other cities that talk about community schools. And so that's one model that kind of bring the community and the parents to actually work more closely together. And then there are initiatives that focus on two-generation solutions that not only that is that we need to work with the parents as well as the children at the same time to actually break that cycle of correlation of inequality. So the last thing that I would say is that a lot of the appointed boards are now pushing resources for early childhood education because a lot of research is suggesting that by the time they get to the third grade, the achievement gap or the reading gap, literacy gap is already there. So the earlier that we could eliminate those gaps, the better. That's why we are seeing a lot of appointed boards now pushing for full-day kindergarten, and even earlier than Head Start. So, for example, Providence, is organizing what we call Providence Talks. That is to actually work with diverse parents with their 6-month-old children to actually push for curriculum and push for reading support environment to empower the parents. So that's what I'm seeing in terms of addressing those kind of inequality questions.
Yeah, my question was more related to looking at the number of school boards in the country, and even here in Missouri, over 400 school boards, and only 3 of them operating on an appointed board. The rest of them elected, and it seemed like only in the urban areas where there are large concentrations of minorities and there's high level of poverty is where we're seeing appointed boards being implemented. And so my concern is, why is that? Why, if it's such a good thing, why are we not seeing that all over the state of Missouri and in other locations? That's the gist of my question.
Yeah, so my earlier comment was that it depends on the state legislative framework. It might require state legislative changes. It might require city charter changes. And so when you get to that process, then there are all these additional stakeholders that would get involved in that process. But the indication is that a lot of the civic community as well as the citywide leaders, elected officials, they are showing their interest and commitment to be a part of the solution now, even though they may not be directly engaged in a formal way in governing public schools. So I'm seeing a lot of new partnership. For example, in Louisville, the example that I just gave on diploma, 8,000 diploma, that's an indication of the citywide commitment among the citywide leaders.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moy. Megan Betts. I'm sorry, Bob Topping, Megan Betts, and Susan Turk.
Good evening. My name is Robert Topping, and in interest of full disclosure, my wife is Sally Topping, president of AFT Local 420. But I am not here tonight as her husband, but I'm here as a citizen of the city of St. Louis and as a stakeholder in this process because my family and I have the job of supporting Sally in her vocation as a teacher in St. Louis Public Schools. And I attended Monday night's session as well as tonight's, and while I want to thank the committee seated in front of me for their service, I am really hard-pressed to understand why this recommendation would be difficult to make. We heard on Monday night that the key to successful education depends on 4 key elements that must be in place for any school system, regardless of the type of board that governs it. While there are places where appointed boards have functioned well, I think we need to admit that the situation in St. Louis is unique, and we need a St. Louis answer to our board governance, not a Chicago solution or a Boston solution or an anywhere else solution. We need to recognize that any change in board governance, as Mr. Gaines pointed out, requires the intervention of the Missouri legislature and Governor Greitens, who is not even here to listen to us and join us in this process. Well, I'm glad he's in Israel. I'm sure he's enjoying himself. But, you know, he's got problems right here in Missouri that maybe you got to pay a little bit more attention to. But at any rate, the point that I want to make is that, in fact, for anyone who's been following the media this week, he is doing everything in his power to take the State Board of Education and politicize it. But in fairness, I don't see Mayor Cruson here, and I don't see Mr. Lewis here either. These are the people who have appointed the current board, and they can't even be bothered to meet with us and listen to our concerns. My daughter got her first job this summer bagging groceries at Snooks for the then St. Louis minimum wage of $10 an hour. The city, wisely, I think, decided that it made sense to try and raise the working people of the city up to a wage that would allow families to climb over the poverty line that so many of our families struggle to break through. The same state legislature you are asking us to trust if you recommend a permanent change to an appointed or hybrid board snatched nearly $1 out of every $4 out of the pocket of the working poor and returned it to their employer by forcing the minimum wage in St. Louis to the state minimum of $7.70 per hour. I am sure Mr. Schnook will sleep easily tonight knowing that the state legislature has his best interests in heart. And our governor wasn't even brave enough to sign that legislation. He, once again, slunk out of town and let it become law by default while he was gone. No, I do not trust these people to appoint our school board. At best, an appointed board relies on the theory of the benevolent dictator. He's answerable to no one, but he's a pretty nice guy. I don't see how that is even conceivable with this legislature and this governor. I know what to do if an elected board doesn't perform. You vote them out. And Mr. Gaines, with all due respect, I used to know how to get rid of you. I don't anymore.
I'm sorry.
No. That was not personal. That was anybody. But it's essentially the same thing. When you're an elected member of this board, we could vote you out. Now that you're appointed, we have no recourse.
I understand.
One of the panel members mentioned on Monday night that there were 64 districts in this state that over a considerable period of time were in danger of losing their accreditation. The real common denominator among them wasn't the elected board. Every district in the state has an elected board. The real common denominator was poverty.
Okay, Mr. Topping, I have to cut it off because we do have 3 more speakers standing up. Ms. Megan Betts, Susan Turk, and Kathleen Farrell. Oh, and I might just say, just so that it's understood, the initial decision on this will be made by DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And both Monday night, they had representatives in this room, and they have a representative here tonight. Ms. Betts.
Hi, yes, I'm going to yield my time to my Missouri State Senator, Jamila Nisheed.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let me first and foremost thank you, Mr. Gang, and as well as each and every one of you that are engaged in the community tonight. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Dr. Adams for, getting us back to where we once were, and that's fully accredited. I mean, in 2007, I was on the front lines. I was fighting a good fight when they took control, and it was very contentious, all right? It was very divisive. And I think this conversation is the same way. I think what people want to hear now is how do we transition back to the elected board? And I'm adamantly opposed to any other kind of board. Appointed board, hybrid board, I am supporting nothing more than an elected board. That's what the people want. And that's what we fought for in 2007, for them not to even take the board away from the St. Louis Public. And Desi did it anyway. So, but my question, though, to you is, why are we not talking about how we get back to the elected board? Because I don't think people in this room, if you raise your hand, how many of you want an elected board? Raise your hand. So the people in this room and the people that fought in 2007, which was thousands of us on the front line, saying that this is not right, that we want to continue to elect our board members. And I think that what we need to know and understand from you all is how do we transition back now that we are fully accredited? And also, make no mistake about it, not under my watch will we have an appointed board or a hybrid board. The people want an elected board, and we now have to listen to the people again. And you guys did a great job, bringing us back to where we are. Because again, in 2007, you had a graduation rate of 55. Now we are at 83. So we're not saying that you didn't do a good job. Now we're saying we can take over. Dr. Adams can stay if he wants to, because he's doing a great job. But let's allow for this board to be elected. And I think we should keep Dr. Adams, because he's the one that brought us back to fully accreditation. So I'm just saying that, how do we begin to talk about the transition back? Because I think that's what people want to talk about. How do we begin to have that dialogue?
In reference to the conversation this evening, Monday night and next Monday night, we are following the dictates that put us, we meaning the SAB, not this panel. This panel was chosen by the SAB to basically represent giving us direction, information, and their opinions on what should be the governing structure. Now, when you ask me, or you ask the SAB, what should we do, or why we are not talking about going back to the elected board, we have never said we were not. The decision is not ours. Ours is to make a recommendation only, and I think it's critically important that that be understood. We had a person who is an elected official, and of all of the things that I heard Monday night, I thought was horrible. For an elected official to come before you and basically say all that the SAB has to do is go to Jefferson City and tell us what to do. That was not that was at least a mistake. I would call it what I would normally call it if I was not sitting in this chair tonight. We do not have the right to do anything other than formulate a recommendation. What we are trying to do with this process is make sure that your wishes are heard in the recommendation that we form. That's why we're having these meetings. That's why we're talking to so many people. That's why we have so many people are being involved in this process. That's why it's an open process. That's why, although we had 262 people who came on Monday night to voice their opinion and ask questions, we had 1,600 who were live streaming. And we want more. We want to have as many and as diverse opinions as we can, and we will make a recommendation. The first people to make a decision about that recommendation, and I repeat, will be DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, who put us in place after the state legislature. And it's important that be understood. The state legislature designed the process under which we have served for the last 10 years based on the conditions of the school system. Now, next. Megan Betts gave up her speaking time. Next is Susan Turk, Kathleen Farrell, and then we have somebody here called Terry, and I don't understand that. We cannot understand it. We will not present it. The first one will be Susan Turk, then Kathleen Farrell, then Natalie Vowell.
There have been a lot of references to the state law that empowers the SAB. From Senate Bill 781, it became RSMO 162.1100. You can all read it. Here is some of what it says. The executive officer of the SAB shall be paid in whole or part with funds from the district and shall have all other powers and duties of a general superintendent of schools. His salary shall be set by the State Board of Education. The SAB and State Board decided not to enforce that provision. More, the Special Administrative Board's powers and duties shall include creating an academic accountability plan, exploration of alternative forms of governance, authority to contract with nonprofit corporations to provide for the operation of the schools, oversight of facility planning, authority to establish school site councils to facilitate site-based management, and the authority to submit a proposal to district voters regarding the establishment of neighborhood schools. The SAB has not enacted all of these powers and duties, and the State Board of Education may cause the transitional school district at any time upon a determination that the transitional district has accomplished the purposes for which it was established and is no longer needed. The State Board of Education shall provide notice to the governor and the General Assembly of the termination, and the termination shall become effective 30 days following such determination. That sounds like a transition of 30 days is allowed for. They have cherry-picked their shalls. They do not have to study alternative governance, despite what you have been told. Our state takeover did not happen because of academic failure. Kansas City Public Schools test scores were much worse than ours for years. They were not taken over by the state. The alleged financial crisis was caused by the governor withholding $60 million from us in the middle of the school year when state revenues did not meet expectations 2003. That was not caused by our school board. And the instability of the superintendent's office occurred during the 3 years Darnetta Klingscale was president of the elected Board of Education. But Mayor Slay did not think that should disqualify her from being appointed to the SAB last year. The imposition of the SAB on the St. Louis Public Schools happened because the business leaders in St. Louis wanted it to. After the mess that they made hiring Bill Roberti, who wasn't qualified, closed 16 schools in 2000, fired 2,000 people in 2003. They couldn't convince the voters to elect their candidates to school board anymore, so they went to the governor to get the state to take over. Yesterday's Post-Dispatch editorial promoting appointed boards furthered that effort to keep control in the hands of the city's oligarchs. Please consider the aspirations of the stakeholders who are speaking to you at these meetings. We want our democracy back. We want our accountable school board back. We want to be engaged in the decisions that affect our children. We want our kids to achieve. We want successful schools. Our elected school board has been patiently waiting in the wings for 10 years. Please recommend the existing elected board be returned to governance.
Ms. Kathleen Farrell, Natalie Vowell, and Jay Ozier.
My name is Kathleen Farrell. I speak on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis. On February 14th, 1917, we sent a registered letter to DESE saying that the League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis supports quality public school supported by voters. In turn, we support the St. Louis public schools and their efforts to create a public education designed for the students of this city. We said now that we are fully accredited, we urge DESE to return, as state statute stipulates, to an elected board. We went on to give the reasons, and this is a long letter. That letter was neither acknowledged nor was it answered. And that is the first step that you are asking us to trust, DESE. Let me also say that this letter came after numerous members of the League of Women Voters, not only from St. Louis but across the state, attempted to meet with every member of any legislative committee that dealt with the oversight and also the budget for St. Louis public schools. To a one, we were told that if we were not their direct constituent, they didn't want to talk to us. This is the legislature that you are asking us to represent us in making this decision rather than the voters of the city of St. Louis. We also attempted to talk to the new governor. You may all know that people don't talk to this governor, and certainly didn't want us to talk to him either. This is the third level of government you are asking us to trust to make this decision. After listening to these meetings, and we are at these meetings, we have 3 points. Number one, if public input, Professor Wong, and I'm also a professor, matters a lot, why not let it happen? I think it very interesting that many of the examples that you cite as good examples, the public directly voted to make the decision. That is not the case here, and therefore it is very difficult to compare those examples to us. If public input is so important, then why make it so indirect to those who say they don't want to listen to it? Why not make it direct and have the vote? Professor Long talked about quote-unquote fragmentation of elected boards. Why are they fragmented, ladies and gentlemen? Because they represent, according to your language, the constituents that they serve. You may call it fragmentation. The League of Women Voters and the people in this room call it democracy. Let me give you the logical extension as my last point. Maybe we ought to allow the state legislature to appoint our mayor and board of aldermen so that they're less fragmented. Or the state legislature, or you know, lots of mornings I wake up these days and would like Congress to be appointed too, and maybe even the President of the United States. This is outrageous. The League of Women Voters has been protecting voting for 100 years. This we will be on the front lines for.
As Ms. Farrell, I think you would find we would welcome your petition, your letter. It will become a written part of our recommendation. Next, Ms. Natalie Vowell, Jay Ozier, then Wale Amusa.
Hi, there's been all this talk about community engagement. As an elected board member, since Sunday, I've been getting constituent phone calls until well after midnight. Texts, emails, I've been responding to these things from all of you and other members of the community who are not able to be with us tonight. I won't go over who appoints who, that's been gone over, but to remove any of the 3 of the special administrative board members, we would have to go through quite a process. I would like to know how many phone calls have you taken from the community? Any of you?
Excuse me, are you requesting that be answered by members of the SAB?
By members of the task force. No phone calls? So,
We have, so that it's understood, we have purposely not given out the phone numbers, addresses, et cetera, of task force members.
Okay.
Ours, those of the SAB, are readily available. But these are people who volunteered to listen to a dramatic amount of information and then make a recommendation. They are not decision makers in any part of this. They are simply people who have volunteered, and or if they're not volunteered,
Time
we've
is running,
asked
Mr.
to
Gaines.
serve. I'm sorry?
I've received phone calls in support of an elected board.
thank you, Board Member Cooksey. So to remove any of you guys from power, we would really have to go through the President of the Board of Aldermen and unelect Lewis Reed. We would have to unelect Mayor Lyda Crewson or or Governor Eric Greitens, even better. The Special Administrative Board has stated that you do not want to remain in power indefinitely, which brings us to the question of who would appoint a new fully appointed board. That would require legislation, new legislation. Nothing in State Statute 162.1100 allows for anything other than an appointed board or an elected board. An appointed board would require new legislation, and we don't know what that is. What would that structure look like for us? And who would be in charge of us? None of us have seen any examples or potential legislation. So how can we, the citizens, form educated decisions? How can we submit our opinions if we don't have all the information? The official St. Louis Public Schools hashtag is We Choose SLPS. Do we? Considering that 9 appointed people will help it choose the educational fate of a city of 315,000 residents, 25,000 SLPS students, and $225 million a year of your tax dollars, I'm not sure who they mean by we. This is not about the individual members who currently serve on the Board of Education. It's about the very concept of democracy in education. A few people high up the chain outside St. Louis could very well take that basic right away from us. Should they get their way, we will not stay quiet. Public education deserves a public voice, and you cannot silence an entire city.
Mr. J. Ozier, Wale Amusa, and Cameron Rhodes.
Yes, this is Jay Ozier. I think that with what we've heard over tonight and the earlier this week, is very clear of those in the city of St. Louis that we cherish our right to vote, and that we believe in democracy with some of the problems that it has, and we surely can see that we've had some problems in that process, particularly as of late. One of the things about education and the public schools in particular that we very seldom is mentioned in the process is, or move past very fast when it's mentioned, is the income disparities in regards to poverty and in terms of housing. I think it was mentioned the other day that nearly 30% of the students in the public schools would not be at the address they are at today. They would not be at that address 1 year from this day. So every 3 years, you got a tremendous, that's a tremendous movement. I do want to also to acknowledge all on the panel, Richard Gaines, the SBA, Superintendent Adams, for all the work and volunteer work that has been done. I know, and most of us do know, that Richard, you have spent a lot of time over the last 40 years in regards to St. Louis Public Schools. But at no time do we really, there's no way that we could really even contemplate giving up our right to vote. that would be like, you know, giving up your firstborn, your birthright, to give that up. And so that's basically what I wanted to say, and I hope that in all this information that you have, that as what's been presented, well, surely you will come to the same conclusion that most of us have come to. Elected school board is the way to go. And we do not want to give that state legislature any chance to, anything that we can prevent from them getting into it, is going to be in our best interest, not to give them the least amount of chance to be involved in the public schools in the city of St. Louis, because the record shows that they're not interested, because they never put their money where their mouth is, and they always shortchange us. Thanks.
Wale Amusa, Corman Rose, and Kayla Reed.
First of all, I want to say good evening, and I want to thank the SAB, the superintendent, and the great employees that are members of Local 420, the people that actually make it happen in the field. I have a comment, and then I have a question for Professor Wong. We are dealing with what we call governance here tonight. But it appears that Professor Wong kind of took it out of context. And he made a lot of assumptions. And he ascribed a lot of accomplishments that are totally out of place. From one researcher to another, I'm very, very disappointed. They claim that appointed boards are responsible for closing the achievement gap is just false. All boards in the country, appointed or non-appointed or elected, because of the incredible commitment that President Obama made to public education all across the country, school boards that have been distressed for a long time are improving outcomes for all students. Whether they are appointed or elected, they are making progress. So it is not fair to come in here and try to sell us some nonsense about appointed boards somehow have some kind of preferred status in changing, in changing achievement gap anywhere in this country. It is teachers that are working very hard, with superintendents that are working very hard, with parents that are doing a better job, and students that are working very hard, that are changing these things that are happening in this country today. With the support of politicians that care about children, politicians that put the resources where they belong. I remember President Obama and the Department of Education spending billions of dollars to specifically address that bottom 20% all across the country that were underperforming. So don't come in here with some racist nonsense trying to deny us credit. Let me put it this way, because racism has a way of undervaluing the lives and the accomplishments of black people. So you are going to claim some kind of appointed board made all these particular achievements, when in fact, because it was a black president that was elected in this country that put the resources in the Department of Education to help uplift all these schools that were failing all across the country. So that is just some crap. We're not going to stand for it. That's some bogus research. Number two, is there any research that an appointed board is inherently incapable or lack the capacity to act in the interest of children or to prioritize resources, resource allocation, or to be accountable? The fact is that there is no research to that extent that says elected boards are incapable of prioritizing resources, of having the capacity to act in the interest of children, and so on and so forth, or lacking the functionality, that gobbledygook that you said earlier, the functionality of expertise, whatever that nonsense means. So I'll put it to you this way.
Mr. Musi, your
I have
time has
20,
expired.
I have 20 seconds, sir. Okay? The fact is that early childhood education, which in this community was promoted by Superintendent Adams with the full support of Local 420, and parents in this community is what is beginning to make the changes. I appreciate what the SAB has done, but I tell you, without the teachers and the educators and the paraprofessional employees, that will not happen. It is time to restore democracy to the people of this community, because black folks are being tired of those who want to go back to those days when we had no rights that anybody is bound to respect. Let's cut the crap.
Carmen Rhodes, Kayla Reed, and Annie Rice. Carmen Rhodes, Kayla Reed, and Annie Rice. Please state your name first, please.
It's Cameron Rhodes, and he said his question was already answered. So I'm Kayla Reed. I am a citizen, resident, voter of the 6th Ward. I am the organizer with St. Louis Action Council, and I am a full-time student at Washington University. I have a couple comments, and I have 3 questions. The first comment: it is my opinion that education should be a public, constitutionally guaranteed right. And for now, it is treated as a public good. An appointed board, in my opinion, destroys the accountability mechanism that preserves our democracy and those public goods. We cannot allow our children, I don't have children, but I have nieces and nephews. We cannot allow our children education to be dependent on an ever-changing and chaotic political landscape. A local elected school board provides the most transparent and accountable process to progressing the St. Louis Public School District. Our city too often falls victim to big donors, private agendas, and conservative propaganda. An appointed board circumvents democracy and removes all bridges to accountability. There is a large and loud conservative movement to privatize education, and this feels like a step in that direction. There is no body more representative and accountable to children's futures than the parents and the voters who will enroll their children in St. Louis Public Schools. So my questions are: 1, how do you account for a difference in political ideologies and allegiances on a local and state level with regard to education and the needs of our students? Most notably, Eric Greitens and a veto-proof Republican legislature having the power to make decisions of a democratic city. 2, are you saying that an appointed board cannot be swayed by political ambitions, private agendas, big donors, or personal opinions? Because I would like to disagree. And 3, when DESE does not grant people what they want, what we want, an elected board, what is our recourse? Because the same governor that appointed 5 new members to DESE is a part of the party that has veto proof in the state legislature, and so we know how this cookie will crumble. And so it is my opinion that we need to not continue to waste time and resources listening to what we have already said. It is my opinion that we need to have a strategy for when they fail us, because that is what they have done since I was a student in 1996 in the St. Louis Public School District to now when I am still a college student in 2017. And so my suggestion, recommendation, my vote is pretty synonymous with the room. We have to return to an elected board. If our voices do not matter, how can we tell babies in schools that theirs will? Thank you.
Kayla Reed, Annie Rice. That was Kayla Reed? It is from, yeah, I thought it was pretty much rhetorical.
Sorry, I'm Annie Rice. I just wanted to make sure that if you wanted answers, you got answers tonight.
Could you please announce your name before you start?
I'll say that again. I'm Annie Rice. I'm the 8th Ward Democratic Committee woman. So first of all, I want to highlight again what Charlie Cooksey said, that our school board president received 26,000 votes when our mayor received 17,000. I think that shows that the city of St. Louis already votes for school board. We care about school board, and that's without a school board, an elected school board that has any power. And I think that should be indicative that we are ready to get back in this. Also, if this body or if DESE decides to do anything other than an immediate return to elected control, we hand over our governance to the state legislature that has shown nothing but disdain for the city of St. Louis. There's a veto-proof majority that we have to come up against, and as soon as they create an appointed scheme of their own, we will be their guinea pigs for school choice. We'll be their guinea pigs to take away even more of our voice for the students in the city of St. Louis. They'll try to gut our teachers' unions and then also gut our ability to vote to get our control back. And I also want to highlight again, I feel like I'm repeating what Kayla said here, but if an appointed board is somehow still democratic, you put an extra barrier in there. If the people who appoint our school board are elected, that's one more extra layer that we have to get to have our voice heard, and that's unacceptable in a democracy. So I have two questions for Professor Wong. First of all, you have received money from the Smith-Richardson Foundation. Are you aware that the Smith-Richardson Foundation also supports a number of far-right groups, including ones designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center as hate groups, such as the Federation for Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, the Cato Institute? Not all of these are hate groups, but these are also ones supported by the Smith-Richardson Foundation and the Manhattan Institute. Yes, you're aware that those are...
I don't think I'm aware of those organizations that receive money from the Smith-Richardson Foundation that you identified. Yeah.
Okay. And also, what is your standard fee for appearing in these sorts of processes?
For
appearing in a situation like tonight, what is your standard fee?
There's no fee involved. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to wrap up my comments, I support an immediate return to an elected board for the city of St. Louis. I think that is the best way forward for our students, for the future of our city, for representation and democracy. Thank you.
I will try and repeat again something that I did mention when we started. Most of the people you will see before you have volunteered to come and speak. We've requested them to come. You had 3 members on Monday night from MSBA and NSBA that came with their own costs on a voluntary basis. Rosine Aldrich, 5th Ward Democratic Committee man. If I mispronounce the name, please, when you announce it or pronounce it, please let me know what it is.
You did a good job, Mr. Gaines.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rasheen Aldridge. I'm the 5th Ward Democratic Committee man. I want to begin by thanking all the volunteers on the task force. I know that you are just putting in a lot of time and a lot of countless effort to also make this a process, hopefully just for the people. I also want to thank everyone who came out today to make sure that we continue to make sure our voices is heard. We continue to inform the panel or whatever recommendation that they come up with that we want one thing, and that is an elected board. I also want to thank all the elected board members if they can stand, because while they're standing, they have countless... Even though they do not have power, they continue to work to try to figure out a way to return power. We all know that this last election, we all went to the ballot box and made it very clear. This last election was one of the highest elections that we had in a long time. It was actually up at the meeting Monday. About 30% of the city had came out and vote, not just for mayor, not just for state reps, and not just for alder people, but they went all the way down the ballot to also elect school board members. And sometimes people do not always go down the ballot, but they did go all the way down the ballot this time. At the last meeting, we also seen that majority, and this is repeated, but majority of our school boards across the country are elected. Now, the issue in St. Louis, if you ask me, is not about the school board. It's not about if it should be elected or appointed. It's about the kids in St. Louis not getting the fair opportunity, not getting the resources that they need to succeed fully in school. Like I stated at the last meeting back Monday, I went to Parkway. So I seen day and night in these schools how one school had plenty of resources, after-school programs, things that you needed to excel to that next level. But in our own city schools, we didn't have those resources, and it wasn't due to the school board. It was due to money that is not flowing in these schools for a reason that who knows why. At the end of the day, I'm sure that you guys are going to come up with a report, but I'm asking you to, when you do this report, as we did on the Ferguson Commission, to put on your equitable lens, because you can go beyond what you're charged to do and can go beyond what is in the charge. And putting on that equitable lens, we will see that an elected board is the right way to go, and that we need to give the resources to the school board and to these kids so they can be successful. I don't think we want to go to appointed board. We know how politics work in this city. It's not going to work in favor of the children, and it's not going to work in favor of the schools in North St. Louis. Please, please, please send us back to an elected board. Thank you.
Matt Heskamp, Jesse Todd, and Carrie Burney. I'm sorry, make that Katie Berry. Matt Heskamp, Jesse Todd, and Katie Berry.
So I'll keep mine rather simple, short, sweet, and to the point. I founded a nonprofit recently called Missouri Political Literacy, where we engage the Board of Aldermen to make them more transparent, accountable, and accessible. And I find this as an important step outside of what I normally do, because this is a really important facet to St. Louis and the citizens here, especially bringing it back to a locally elected position, well, elected board, because it's transparent, democratic, and accountable, because the voters in this city aren't as dumb as this presentation today made them sound to be.
Jesse Todd.
My name is Jesse Todd. I went to St. Louis Public Schools, attended the St. Louis Public School System. My kids attended the St. Louis Public School System. I taught in the St. Louis Public School System. I'm an elected official. I tell you, first of all, this is racism 101. And the reason that it's racism 101, the schools that are being taken over, appointed, are black. That's why it's racism 101. Number two, poverty. We haven't mentioned one time I was in the classrooms, kids coming in hungry. That has an effect on test scores. Why haven't you studied that? The other thing that has, how about the summer? Did you mention that they get free lunches, free breakfast, free lunch during the school year? When they're out of school, they don't get anything. You should have put some of that in your study during the summer. But one solution would be to have the school, they could go to summer school, extended school year, help increase test scores. Changing the curriculum. You have a Eurocentric curriculum. You need to emphasize some blackness in these schools, because the schools are predominantly black. That would increase the self-esteem, the confidence, and everything of the kids. So those are some of the things, and you cannot have accountability without democracy. You cannot. Look at this. Right now, we are having the board, the Board of Alder people. I'm leading the struggle through the Democratic Central Committee with petitions to put it back on the ballot. They're cutting the wards in half, and the reason they're cutting them in half so that it can cost more to elect people and take the elected officials farther away from the voters. And then we haven't dealt with the crack cocaine that came into our black community that created mass incarceration that was directly at black people. And these were politicians that you're talking about that are going to appoint somebody to a school board. No, they are the ones who created the problem. Some of those parents right tonight are sitting up in prison with all of those long sentences with crack cocaine. Now we have an opioid epidemic. You don't see any of those going to prison. So I say it is, again, it's racism. What we need to do, we need to have democracy. We pay for the schools, and when you pay for something, and the only way to change the system is through democracy, because an appointed school board is going to be the same mayors and other people that are going to appoint people that they can control, and those are political appointments. But it's an oligarchy. And we need to have, instead of oligarchy, we need to have democracy. Thank you.
Just one thing I'd like to say, because this is something that a number of us are very proud of. The children who go to St. Louis Public Schools receive 2 meals free. We have 80% of our students who meet free and the free meal statute. In a matter of approximately another 3 or 4 weeks, all children, regardless of their financial status, will be receiving free meals. Now, when I say free meals, we're talking breakfast and lunch. That's 2 of the, quote, 3 meals a day. I think it's important that you understand that when we were impaneled, this school system was buying the lowest grade foodstuffs available by the Department of who was that? Department of the Agriculture in the nation. We were ranked by the Physicians Mutual as with an F for the quality of foods that were being served to the children in schoolrooms. This school system now is ranked #1. I won't say #1, it's ranked A. You will have noticed that Bill Clinton, former president, was here last week. He was here to congratulate the school on the food programs, the nutritional aspects now of the food program in St. Louis Public Schools. There are a lot of things that have to be made better. We know that. All of us know that. But let's talk realistically about some things that are better. And that is one area in food service that this school system is doing better. The next speakers, Katie Berry, Janine Mollop, and Tony Zabrowski. Katie Berry, Janine Mollop, and Tony Zabrowski.
I'm sorry, I'm a shorty. My name is Janine Moloff. I am a retired speech-language pathologist from the St. Louis Public Schools of some 30 years tenure. I did everything from early childhood special ed on through high school. I want to say very simply, I do challenge you, Dr. Wong, and on your accusations. You showed us old data. You did not actually establish causality between your claims and what your data said. You didn't produce a control group, nothing. That being said, however, what this is really about is about democracy. It is absolutely horrible. No, it's disgraceful and obscene that we have to come here and plead with people from the state and volunteers for our God-given right to self-govern through a democracy. What part of that is so difficult to understand? Right now, we're supposed to be setting the example for our children. How in the world can we tell them that democracy is good when we actually don't have one right here? When we have the equivalent of a poll tax? Communities that are too poor to be able to actually afford to fully fund their schools, well, you don't get to have your votes counted. The results of your publicly elected board members is going to be thrown out. That's a poll tax, a de facto poll tax, but that's what it is. And it's Jim Crow. It is not just based on race, it is also based on economic level. This is the 21st century version of Jim Crow. There's no moral justification for this at all. And even though some of you people, you sat up here and you volunteered your time, but did you give a thought, even for a second, as to what you were signing up for? To represent a group, an SAB, that is totally illegitimate. When they took over our publicly elected board and produced one to their liking and threw out the results of a fair election, they disenfranchised an entire city of voters. And I do believe it was Dr. King that said an injustice against one is an injustice against all. Well, Dr. Adams, our right to vote should count. And right now it doesn't. And right now I'm going to announce, frankly, that I'm going to be joining, hopefully, my friend Bruce Franks in the state legislature. And if I do get elected, I can guarantee you there will, sir, be investigations. And there will be possible criminal charges filed and subpoenas, because frankly, the DESI, Mayor Slay, Jay Nixon, the SAB, none of you had the right to disenfranchise a single person here. And everybody, we're in this together. We're all supposed to be Americans. So how about make that document, the Bill of Rights, a living document, and stand together? Because no matter what you say, we will have our democracy back again.
Tony Zabrowski, Philip Wills, and Sid Chase.
Good evening. It's late. My name is Tony Zabrowski, and I have a child in St. Louis Public Schools at Mason Elementary. I obviously support elected board. I worked hard to get some of the folks elected sitting here today. I did come to at least take a moment to listen to what Dr. Wong had to say, and definitely was enlightened and encouraged by the questions that the task force asked this evening. So I want to thank you all for the questions that you brought to Dr. Wong. I was given a flyer walking in here slandering Dr. Wong quite aggressively. I Googled him and his research, and unless the Center for American Progress is right wing and John Podesta and Tom Daschle are right wing, his main paper that he cited his research from was actually published by them, just in case anybody was interested. And I thought it was also very interesting that it was majority Democratic mayors who seized control of that. I'm only pointing these things out not to say that it's okay, right? I don't think it's okay. I think we should really look at the fact that I hear a lot of fear about Republican elected officials disenfranchising voters, but are we not also concerned about Democratic representatives disenfranchising the voters? When I look at the history of this movement of mayor-directed school boards, Jackson, Mississippi has had it for 200 years, and then in 1995, Boston gave it a shot, and a few other schools gave it a shot, and yeah, their main problem was fragmentation, right? But I think our schools have gone through periods that are reflective of our times. And I would love to talk to Dr. Wong more about how his research could actually be affected by the time and the place that this movement has happened. In earnest, 11 cities were studied. 5 cities had great improvements in the education with a mayor-appointed board, and 4 had minor improvements. But I didn't see anything in my quick research I had. Well, I've had 4 hours to do it. I didn't see anything that showed correlation, and I just wonder if it's more about a time. But anyway, I just got up here to say that Republican or Democrat, elected officials on both sides of the aisle are here to disenfranchise you. I would be just as worried, I should say, about a mayor who did not receive as many votes as the school board president. I think we should keep that in mind.
Your time
Thank
has
you.
expired. Philip Weeks, Sid Chase, Dan Delfa. Please
Hello.
say out your name first.
Yes. Hello, my name is Philip Weeks. I think Dr. Wong's models really don't apply to St. Louis City, and the models he presented would not accurately reflect the desires of the people of the St. Louis City. One is because of the vision factor, and two is because of accountability. The vision that he's talking about would be established by the governor and the mayor. The governor received 15% of the vote of St. Louis City. Do we want a governor with 15% of the vote of St. Louis City deciding who's going to be on the board? That was in the majority of your model. Second of all, how do we hold a governor accountable who only received 15%? Give him 10%? Okay, so in addition, our St. Louis mayor only received 33% of the vote. So with this vision of these two, we're not operating on a scale of democracy accountability. There is not the democracy accountability you would like. Your models don't apply to this situation. So we need an elected board to reflect the democracy of St. Louis City. In fact, our model would be more similar to Michigan. In Michigan, they had an emergency manager who basically destroyed the Detroit school system. He took away one of the most successful public schools that had a high graduation rate. Okay, second of all, we see in Michigan what happens when you take democracy away and you appoint basically what is an emergency management, whether it's a board or in the case of Flint, where you had emergency management. We know what happened in Flint. We know what happened in Detroit. We know what happens when you have the interest of the state, which is different from the interest of the city. You're talking about fragmentation. Fragmentation exists in our legislature. And unfortunately, the fragmentation of the Missouri legislature would be more fragmented than any representation in St. Louis City. We do not want to forfeit our democracy to a model that you presented. Thank you.
Sid Chase.
My name is Sid Chase. I'm a teacher. Some of you know me. I'm on the Internal Board of Review. By the way, Kaylin, congratulations on your appointment to this, and hope you serve well. I have just a couple of things to say. The word fragmentation has been bandied about. It started with Dr. Wong. I accept that, but you've got to realize something, Dr. Wong. Democracy is messy. It's always messy. That's what democracy is. It's a mess, but it's the best thing that there is, okay? Town hall meetings are a mess, but they're what we have. Congress is a mess, and it's wonderful, okay? It's the people's house. That's what we are. We are not autocrats. We don't move from the top down. We move from the bottom up. That's what we do. And sometimes it takes a long time to make something happen. Sometimes it's more of a mess, but it's the greatest thing going. That's America. Anything else is foreign. Okay, secondly, Dr. Wong, you're being Pollyanna, completely Pollyanna. Philadelphia is dysfunctional. You always cite it. The mayor has to beg the governor to get 5 cents for the public schools in Philadelphia. It doesn't work. It's dysfunctional. Baltimore is dysfunctional. Detroit is dysfunctional. The governor has appointed a string of people before just now they went back to the elected board. They had a string of managers, none of whom could make it happen. What happens is democracy eventually rears its ugly head in America, and we have it. Well, we'll get you there, folks. May take a while, but we'll get you there. In Hartford, what they did was they appointed so many, they made it necessary to have so many different groups on the board that nobody can operate. Every single ethnic, religious, racial, whatever group had to be on the board. So in Hartford, nothing happens because nobody has any power. The only way it happens is when everybody elects those who are standing for election. Democracy is very important. It is what we are in this country. And doctor, it doesn't work your way. Yours is neat, yours is pretty, and it just doesn't work. Thank you.
Dan Delfa, Dorothy Rhodey Collins.
My question's pretty much been answered at this point, so I'll just briefly say we want an elected board. Thank you.
My name is Dorothy Rhodey Collins. I'm an SLPS parent, former SLPS teacher, and a current member of the elected board. When I hear Dr. Wong speaking about a lot of the things that appointed boards can leverage, things like evidence-based practices, emphasizing reading scores, all of those things are well established in research. They're available to anyone. They are not things that appointed boards are uniquely positioned to carry out. To base this whole decision on something that anybody can do, and some of the task force members reference that, there is no reason that some of those practices that appointed boards carry out cannot be implemented by appointed boards is kind of silly to make this assumption that only appointed boards can do those things. In addition, I heard him speaking about teachers' unions and how somehow appointed boards work more closely with teachers' unions. Well, Local 420 has publicly stated they are fully in support of an elected board. So if we have anything other than that, I fail to see how that is somehow going to allow the teachers' union and the school board to work well together. I've heard several people kind of mention, but wanted to explicitly state again that it seems to me that there is a correlation between the rise of these appointed boards and the rise of charter schools in the 90s. Our former Mayor Slay, current Mayor Cruson, and our current Governor Greitens are all on record in support of charter schools. They're proponents of charter schools. They're proponents of vouchers. We don't need more charter schools in the city of St. Louis. We need neighborhood schools. We need community schools. Our teachers need supplies. Our parents need to feel that they can access district leadership. Our students need to feel that they belong to this community, that their rights, I guess, are represented. Our taxpayers need accountability. All of those things are things that we need, but we don't need more charter schools. And if you look at Dr. Wong's research, he explicitly states that in mayoral control, mayors should leverage charter schools and they should outsource these things. So it's hard for me to have some confidence in this research if the whole goal is designed to put more charter schools into cities.
Alderwoman Marlene Davis, Mabel Davis.
I've come to the conclusion where I'm not going to say much now, because I realize that the purpose of being here, the topic should be about resolution. The appointed board has no authority to give a new direction. This task force has no authority to give new direction. The mayor or the board of aldermen has no authority to give new direction. When I was president of this school board, I never argued with this, whatever, I don't know who was mayor then. Because you know what? You don't have no power over me. You have no authority to help me. You get on the bus, get in the car, go to Jefferson City. We achieved a lot under a Republican-controlled state house. That's where all of this energy needs to be bottled and taken to the steps, taken to the door. Stand on it, because I'm going to tell you, I stood on somebody's toes, and his little nose turned red and everything. But you know, when we got through, we said, well, no, this is not how to do this. And the board members and the superintendent sat down, and you figure out how to make it happen. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to win and everybody want to look good. Use that to your advantage at this moment. Stop arguing with each other. Stop pointing fingers at each other. They didn't appoint themselves. They had nothing to do with that. And go back and do the research and see where the bill came from. Get it right. Get it right. That's all I'm going to say to the whole room. Get it right. Don't waste your energy in the wrong place, because you'll never get nothing. And when people lead you down a wrong path with rhetoric in the wrong place, you will never get what you want. Because the ones that are sitting up there safe, because you're not even talking to them. Go get it done. I'll go with you. I'll pay for the bus.
Mabel Davis, Bruce Franks Jr. Mabel Davis, Mabel Davis, Mabel Davis, Bruce Franks Jr.
I'm State Representative Bruce Franks Jr. I'm going to say some things differently than I was going to say, especially because of the last comments from our well-respected alderwoman. First off, I want to genuinely thank Adolphus Pruitt for enlightening me at the last meeting about where to go. It's right to research, but this transition between generations, when it comes to legislation and everything else, that communication gap is a problem. Because when we hear that often, we're hearing pick yourself up by your bootstraps, rather than educate those up under you and those that need that education. So I thank you for that. What I will say is that, with all due respect to Marlene Davis, who I call Auntie Marlene, it was Republican ran then, but it don't look like it look now. We're talking about 163 seats, with 46 of those Democrats, and 55% of those Democrats, I don't know if they Democrats. I ran for office for the same reason that everybody in this room has been standing up and saying different stuff about how they don't trust the legislature. They didn't differ between Republican and Democrat, they just said the state legislature. And I ran because I don't trust the state legislature. So if we could have at least one person or two people or five people that the people can trust, that's what it's about. And we keep hearing this thing that, that this particular group doesn't make a decision, but they give a recommendation. This wasn't put together for no reason. They were put together to hear concerns, to come from their different perspectives and give their perspective on what they heard. So they're absolutely helping and aiding in making a decision. And when I think about this process, I think about last meeting and this meeting. Last meeting, the folks who got up and talked, they said that, well, we were told to not give a biased point of view. That's totally different from this one, because that's about as biased as it gets. We didn't get the this side and that side and then let's meet in the middle. We got the this is why this particular board runs this way and this is why it should run this way, which is an issue in itself. And I don't know if it got addressed or not, but Prince George County is 65% black. So
if you could look at another example and give us one, because that was one of the best questions that was asked when you talked about appointed boards and being in Black communities. So basically, I'm here to reiterate everything that everybody else said. But at the end of the day, when you get the buy-in from the community and the community is telling you that this is what they want, as the folks that's listening to the community, it's your job to deliver that message.
This is for all of you who chose to come out this evening. Share with us your thoughts about not only the process, but your thoughts about what education leadership in this community needs to be going forward. We welcome the comments, all comments. We appreciate your patience with this process, but it is honestly and earnestly an open process. And at the end of the day, a position reflective of what we as an SAB believe will go forward to the state, and the state being the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. The people who sit on this panel will help us make that decision. You and your involvement, both here in this room and those that we think are thousands that are listening on social media this evening, we thank you, we appreciate you, and we will have one more session, which will be next Monday at Northwest High School, as I knew it. It will start at the same time at 6:30, and at that time, we will have a presentation on hybrid boards, combinations of elected and appointed. Thank you so much this evening.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your leadership. Yeah. A lot of very good comments. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Actually, you folks have a tough job to do.